What if history wasn't just written, it was rewritten by coincidence? A king's fate echoed in his doctor's hands. A sci-fi prophecy turned into your morning news. A painter's missing eyebrows sparked centuries of speculation. These aren't accidents. They're breadcrumbs in the timeline, taunting, looping, refusing to make sense. Welcome to 101 Strangest Historical Coincidences, a journey through the absurd, the eerie, and the uncomfortably poetic. Some call them chance, others call them fate. We just call them unexplained. Ready to lose your grip on causality? Good. Let's begin. Before we dive headfirst into the weird spiral of history, hit that subscribe button unless you're allergic to mystery, in which case, good luck out there. While you're at it, drop a comment. Where in the world are you tuning in from? And what unholy hour have you decided to fall down this rabbit hole? Midnight in Montana? Sunrise in Seoul? We want to know who else is wide awake, asking the same weird questions. The French king and his executioner's grandson. There's something almost too poetic about the end of a monarchy being tied up neatly in a family's job description. King Louis XVI, the most royal of necks, met his end beneath the blade of the guillotine in 1793. The man holding the rope was Charles-Henri Sanson, France's most professional executioner, 7 generations deep in bloodshed. Now, here's the twist. Years later, Sanson's grandson, Henry, would become a doctor. A healer, but not just any healer. He used that same guillotine era branded as surgical equipment for amputations. In other words, the instrument of royal death evolved into a tool for saving lives. Kind of. What do you do when your family heirloom is a beheading device? Apparently, you sterilize it and keep working. The grandson's justification? Efficiency. Clean cuts, less trauma. Somehow, in the churn of revolutionary France, a blade meant for justice ended up in a hospital ward, hacking off limbs in the name of mercy. Was this redemption, irony, or just France being France? And yet, nothing says unresolved legacy like using a tool of execution to preserve life. But if you thought that was the strangest narrative time loop France ever produced, wait until you hear about a novelist who may have been born too late and yet just in time. The author and the city. Charles Dickens was born in 1812 comfortably after the blood-soaked frenzy of the French Revolution. You'd think that would give him some distance, but no. A Tale of Two Cities, his magnum opus on guillotines, Parisian mobs, and the tragic symmetry of justice, reads like he was there dodging cobblestones and scribbling from a cafe while people lost their heads. Why did Dickens, a man rooted in the soot and smog of industrial London, fixate so intimately on a revolution he never witnessed? Maybe because the echoes of 1789 never stopped. He lived in a time when its survivors were still very much alive, walking reminders that the age of monarchs wasn't so long ago. The terror of the revolution didn't fade. It rippled forward, infecting art, politics, and apparently, the imagination of a man with a flair for social misery. But here's the coincidence that sticks. Dickens captured the paranoia, class rage, and duality of London and Paris without ever setting foot in revolutionary France. It's like he had a wormhole to the past, or maybe trauma just lingers in the bricks of old cities. And speaking of sharks in the water, literal ones, this time-worn next tale involves a mechanical monster and its eerily named counterpart lurking in the real ocean. The Jaws prop and the real shark. They called it Bruce. Not the shark itself, well, not the real one. Bruce was the animatronic beast built for Spielberg's 1975 blockbuster Jaws. Malfunctioning, expensive, temperamental, and unforgettable. Bruce was meant to be terrifying, but ironically, it was his frequent mechanical failures that forced Spielberg to rely on suspense rather than gore, making the film all the more iconic. Fast forward to 2013. In the deep blue off the coast of Guadalupe Island, researchers encounter something else named Bruce. But this time, she's real. Deep Blue, as she came to be known, is a great white shark stretching over 20 feet long, one of the largest ever recorded. Gentle and slow-moving, yet unmistakably powerful, Deep Blue became a media darling and a marine biology marvel. The name? A coincidencer, a callback, depending on how you see time. Here we are, nearly 40 years after Jaws, and we find a real-life shark echoing a cinematic phantom. Bruce was fiction, Deep Blue, nature, both unforgettable. Both symbols of fear, awe, and the unpredictable cruelty of the ocean. And just like those twin sharks, history too has its doubles rival cities founded in myth and separated by rivers, but somehow spiritually twinned across time. The twin cities and their founding leaders. Romulus and Remus, the twin brothers suckled by a she-wolf, and destined to found Romeo rather. For one of them to kill the other, and then found Romeo the kind of mythological figures that ancient cities dream of. It's brutal, it's symbolic, and it's weirdly romantic. But their story isn't just a tale of empire building. It's a blueprint. One city, born in blood, claiming divine sanction. A leader who is both founder and fratricide. Rome, the eternal city, had its myth written in stone. Paris? Not quite the same. According to legend, its earliest settlers were the Parisii, a tribe of Celtic origin. No wolf-suckling twins, no cosmic omen, no public relations-worthy origin story. Just a bunch of river folk who thought the Seine looked like a good spot to hang out. And yet, Paris and Prometheus' so-called twin cities grew into the cultural and political capitals of Europe. One spawned emperors, the other philosophers. Both mastered the art of revolution. Both built empires of art, style, and attitude. And both were shaped, oddly enough, by invisible mythologies, where founding figures loom large or not at all. But if cities can be symbolic twins, what does it mean when two men own, Russian, one American embody, a cosmic rivalry that rockets humanity into space? The first man in space and the first man on the moon, country. In 1961, Yuri Gagarin, a grinning Soviet cosmonaut barely 5'2", crammed himself into a metal ball and hurled around the Earth. He became the first human in Spacino GPS. No escape plan, just vodka-fueled courage and Cold War glory. 8 years later, an American named Neil Armstrong touched down on the moon, stepping out of a slightly more advanced tin can to deliver a line so carefully rehearsed it practically became scripture. 2 men, 2 nations, 1 celestial staring contest. Gagarin never made it to the moon. Armstrong never orbited Earth in total solitude. But together, they symbolized a race no one really wanted but everyone had to win. The Cold War turned science into theater. Rockets were launched not just to explore, but to assert dominance. National pride tethered to the void. It's a historical coincidence dressed as a cosmic duel. The first man in space from one side of the Iron Curtain, the first man on the moon from the other. Like chess grandmasters swapping queens, both moves changed the game forever. But while humanity looked to the stars, another genius remained grounded, haunted by melodies he couldn't finish, and a symphony that would never be complete. The composer and the unfinished symphony. Franz Schubert died at 31. That's not the coincidence, that's just the tragedy. The coincidence is what he left behind. Symphony number 8 in B minor, better known as the Unfinished Symphony. Only 2 movements completed, no explanation, no finale, just silence where music should be. Musicologists have puzzled over it for centuries. Did Schubert run out of time? Inspiration? Paper? Was it a deliberate artistic choice or a cruel twist of fate? Imagine Beethoven abandoning the 9th halfway through. Yet Schubert did just that, except no one's really sure why. Here's the kicker. The two movements he did finish are hauntingly perfect. So much so that any attempt to complete the symphony feels like forgery. The unfinished becomes sacred. The absence becomes the point. And so, Schubert lives in limbo, not just as a composer, but as a kind of eternal ghost in the concert hall. His music hangs mid-air, suspended between brilliance and silence. Like a conversation cut off at the most beautiful moment. But silence isn't the only thing that lingers after a masterpiece. Sometimes, it's war stories, real ones, featuring Jedi, landing crafts, and a future galactic knight ferrying troops into day, the Star Wars actor, and his role in WWII. Before he was Obi-Wan Kenobi, a spectral mentor with cryptic advice and a very suspicious view of the high ground, Sir Alec Guinness was Lieutenant Alec Guinness, Royal Naval Reserve. It's the kind of footnote that gets buried in IMDb trivia, but it's real. The man who would later guide Luke Skywalker through a galaxy far, far away once piloted landing crafts through real gunfire. On the very real beaches of Normandy, during day. There's something chillingly poetic about it. Guinness, soft-spoken and cerebral in his roles, spent part of his 20s immersed in the noise of war. Not just playing a soldier, but being one. It adds an eerie dimension to his performance in Star Wars. The serenity, the fatalism, the gentle authority. It wasn't just acting, it was remembering. And then there's this. Star Wars, a fantasy of rebellion, fascism, and fathers came to life, thanks to a man who had already survived history's most infamous war. Maybe that's why his presence carries weight in the film. Because he wasn't just pretending. But long before lightsabers and intergalactic conflict, another invention changed the way we connected. And its creator? A man inspired not just by science, but by the sound of his own mother. 7 coincidences down, 94 to go, and we haven't even hit the really bizarre ones yet. If your brain's already buzzing, take a second to subscribe so you don't miss the descent into full historical madness. And tell us in the comments, where are you watching from, and what time is it right now? Are you on a lunch break in Lisbon, or wide-eyed at 3 a.m. in Jakarta? Let's see how far this web of strangeness stretches. The inventor of the telephone, and his mother's name. Alexander Graham Bell invented the telephone in 1876, and with it, the world's most enduring ringtone of progress. It's a clean story, usually. Brilliant inventor, flash of insight, first call, boom modern communication. But then you learn about Eliza, his mother, deaf. And suddenly, the telephone becomes something more than just wires and patents. It becomes a personal rebellion against silence. Eliza Bell's deafness shaped Alexander's world. He grew up in a house where communication meant reading lips, gesturing, finding meaning beyond sound. It wasn't just a technical problem, it was intimate. That his mother's name was Eliza, a name echoing in his personal life as he shaped history, feels too precise to be pure coincidence. Even stranger, Bell's wife, Mabel, was also deaf. This man, so associated with voice, spent his life surrounded by silence, and yet he gave the world a voice it never knew it needed. The irony is brutal and elegant. The inventor of the telephone, companion to the deaf. His mother never heard a ringtone. His wife never heard him say, "I love you," over the wire. And still, he changed everything. Speaking of hearing things that might not be their hour, next coincidence involves a Dutch master, a military parade, and a painting that refuses to stand still. The artist who painted the Night Watch, and the year it was completed. In 1642, Rembrandt van Rijn finished his most famous work, The Night Watch. It's not actually nighttime, and it's not a watch, which is very on-brand for Rembrandt, a man who never let titles get in the way of a good enigma. The painting depicts a militia company, caught in mid-motion, like a dream frozen mid-blink. A girl glows from the shadows. A musket is raised, faces blur into movement. But here's the coincidence. 1642 wasn't just the year Rembrandt painted this confusing masterpiece. It was also the year his wife Saskia died. And something in the night watch changed with her passing. It stopped being just a civic portrait and became something stranger, more theatrical, more haunted. People have speculated for centuries that Rembrandt inserted his own grief into the work. A death in real life. A strange parade on canvas. The timing is too eerie, too close. A moment of personal darkness projected onto a painting supposedly about civic pride. Art historians still debate it, but stand in front of the night watch and you'll feel it. A rupture, a shadow under the surface. And if you follow that shadow far enough, you'll stumble into the kind of royal heartbreak that shook a crown clean off its neck. The king who abdicated and the Duke of Windsor. In 1936, King Edward VIII did something no English monarch had dared to do before. He quit, abdicated, gave up the whole kingdom for a wife routine, like it was just too much admin. The reason? Wallis Simpson, a twice-divorced American woman with a sharp tongue and a sharper sense of style. Their love story was tabloid dynamite, and constitutional crisis rolled into one, a public scandal that made monarchy look weirdly romantic. But here's the twist. Edward VIII didn't just disappear into obscurity. He was reborn as the Duke of Windsor, a title that sounded elegant but carried a bitter aftertaste of exile. His new role came with no power, limited relevance, and a lifetime of awkward tea invitations. Oh, and his father, King George V, died the very same year. A literal passing of the crown, like Shakespeare ghostwriting real life. 1 year, one crown lost, one title gained. The monarchy reshuffled like a deck of gilded cards. And as Edward became history's most stylish footnote, Britain stumbled forward into a world bracing for war. But over in America, something else was falling from the sky. Wood, canvas, and 2 unlucky men who made aviation history the hard way. The first passenger plane crash, and its significance. The Wright brothers are on top of the world literally. Their fragile flying machines have defied gravity, and humanity is collectively losing its mind over the future of flight. Enter Orville Wright, one half of the dynamic duo, offering rides to curious officials. Among them, Lieutenant Thomas Selfridge, a man who would go down in history not for his bravery, but for being in the wrong seat at the wrong time. The plane crashes. Selfridge dies. Orville survives, barely. It becomes the first fatal crash involving a powered aircraft and a passenger, and with that, aviation gains its first ghost. The coincidence? The Wrights had made flight look effortless, magical even. Just a few years earlier, people were still strapping wings to their arms and jumping off barns. Now, in the blink of a propeller, death had entered the chat. But it didn't stop them. Aviation didn't stall. It soared. Selfridge's name faded into footnotes while planes became commonplace, as if the sky itself had demanded a blood price before it would open. And speaking of things that mysteriously vanish, our next tale sets sail into a different kind of disappearance, one that left a ship intact, but its crew gone without a trace. The Mary Celeste and the abandoned ship. December 1872. A merchant ship named Mary Celeste is found drifting aimlessly in the Atlantic. No crew, no distress signal, no signs of struggle. Her cargo of industrial alcohol remains untouched. Personal belongings are still in place. The ship is in fine shape except it's eerily empty, like a stage with all the actors gone mid-performance. The mystery is tantalizing because it's so clean. No pirates, no wreckage, no notes scribbled in desperation, just silence. And coincidence? The Mary Celeste had departed under an experienced captain with his wife and young daughter on board. It was supposed to be routine. Instead, it became legend. Theories exploded. Mutiny, sea monsters, spontaneous alcohol explosion, alien abduction, because, of course, nothing sticks. The facts are just inconvenient enough to defy logic. It's as if the sea swallowed not just bodies but reasons. And what truly haunts us is the preservation. The unbroken plates, the unmoved compass, the half-eaten breakfast still on the table. People don't just evaporate, and yet they did. So now the stage is empty, the curtain's still up, but the cast? Gone. And if you think that's the weirdest vanishing act connected to a famous name, wait until we introduce a writer whose legacy collided with an empire and an armada. The author and the Spanish Armada. Sir Walter Raleigh wasn't just a writer. He was a myth in human form sailor, courtier, colonizer, and yes, occasional poet. His name is tangled with the roots of the British Empire, tobacco smoke, and stories of laying his cloak over puddles for queens. A bit of a Renaissance influencer, if we're honest. And yet, when the Spanish Armada surged toward England in 1588, he wasn't at the helm of a warship. He wasn't even in the middle of the action. He was just adjacent. Still, Raleigh's fingerprints are all over that era. He was a favorite of Queen Elizabeth I, whose reign coincided with the defeat of the Armada. He promoted colonial expansion, the very ideology that would flourish once Spain's naval dominance was cracked, and he chronicled his times like someone who knew his every move would be studied later. The coincidence isn't that he fought in the battle he didn't. It's that he represented the very England that emerged after it. Confident, expansionist, over-caffeinated with ambition. Raleigh, man of letters, coincided with one of the most crucial military defeats in European history, not as a warrior, but as a witness whose life was sculpted by the echoes of victory. But for our next coincidence, we're leaving the Elizabethan stage and entering the smoky world of Deduction, where the actor playing Sherlock Holmes might as well have been chasing his own reflection in a foggy mirror. The actor who played Sherlock Holmes in his later role as Dr. Watson. Sherlock Holmes and Dr. Watson, genius and grounding rod, logic and loyalty. Their bond is so tight it's practically mythological. So when Basil Rathbone stepped into Holmes's houndstooth coat for a string of films in the 1930s and 40s, he was Sherlock for a generation. Cold eyes, sharpened cheekbones, pipe like a punctuation mark. But here's the curiosity. While Rathbone owned the role of Holmes, his co-star, Nigel Bruce, cemented the image of Watson as the affable, slightly bumbling sidekick in interpretation that irked Conan Doyle purists. No actor ever truly played both Holmes and Watson, but the line between them blurred more than once. Several actors across film history have been cast in both roles, just not in the same series. It's like a theatrical palindrome. Holmes becomes Watson, Watson becomes Holmes. What makes it uncanny is how these reversals mirror the characters themselves. Holmes and Watson need each other. In a way, they are each other two halves of one mind. One observes, the other records. One deduces, the other doubts. It's a perfect dramatic loop. And speaking of loops, few things capture a cultural revolution spiraling into sound quite like a psychedelic album that turned four lads from Liverpool into cosmic prophets. The band that released Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band, and the counterculture? The summer of love, flower power, LSD in the water supply, metaphorically. And into this whirlpool of incense and idealism dropped Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band, an album that felt less like a collection of songs and more like a transmission from an alternate dimension. The Beatles didn't just change their sound, they abandoned their identities entirely. No more mop tops, no more matching suits, just alter egos, sitters, and conceptual weirdness. The coincidence isn't that it landed during the counterculture movement. It's that it became the movement's soundtrack, without ever intending to. Lennon, McCartney, Harrison, and Starr were experimenting with art. The world heard prophecy. Suddenly, these four were oracles of peace, rebellion, and subconscious mind-melding. And here's where it gets stranger. They recorded it in the same Abbey Road studios where they'd once played tidy pop songs about holding hands. Within a few years, they'd fragmented entirely. The album that unified a generation also planted the seeds of their unraveling. One cultural high, one personal breaking point. But death never quite forgets its calendar. And as revolutions burn bright, some founding fathers choose a date to leave that's a bit too perfect to be coincidence. The founding father who died on the 4th of July, different from Adams Jefferson. James Monroe died on the 4th of July, 1831. That's already suspicious. But it gets better or worse, depending on your tolerance for historical weirdness. Because Monroe wasn't the first founding father to drop dead on Independence Day, he was the third. Thomas Jefferson and John Adams, two Revolution architects turned bitter pen pals, had both died exactly 5 years earlier, on the 4th of July, 1826, on the 50th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence. No less. So when Monroe died on the 4th of July too, it felt like the Republic was orchestrating its own myth. As if the nation itself had built an off switch for its founders that activated once a year like a patriotic version of the Purge, but with more powdered wigs and fewer pitchforks. The coincidence smells staged. It begs for conspiracy. 3 presidents, all linked to the nation's birth, all checking out on its birthday? Come on. But perhaps it's more poetic than paranoid. America was still young, still crafting its identity. And what better narrative than a chorus of revolutionaries who depart stage left on cue just as the fireworks go up? But not all finales are clean. Some are messy, defiant and louder than cannon fire, especially when composed by a man who could no longer hear a single note. The composer who went deaf and his greatest works. Beethoven losing his hearing is one of those biographical facts that sounds too symbolic to be real. Like Shakespeare being born and dying on the same day, or a fireman being afraid of fire, but it's true. Around his late 20s, Ludwig van Beethoven musical titan, revolutionary romantic, began to go deaf, not instantly, slowly, cruelly. At first it was just a ringing, then muffled tones, then silence. And yet, during that silence, he wrote some of his most profound and expansive works. The Ninth Symphony, the late string quartets, these weren't just compositions, they were eruptions. Music unbound by hearing. It's as though, once stripped of the world's noise, he heard something else, something deeper, something purer. The coincidence lies in the inverse. The more deaf he became, the more transcendent his music grew. As if the universe, in an act of perverse compensation, gave him divine melody while stealing away his ability to hear it. His ninth ends with Ode to Joy, an explosion of choral ecstasy written by a man who hadn't heard a voice in years. When it premiered, someone had to turn him around to see the applause. He couldn't hear it. But not all love stories are about applause. Some are about grape-stained gowns, slapstick timing, and the strange overlap between fiction and real-life matrimony. The I Love Lucy stars and their real-life marriage. Lucille Ball and Desi Arnaz weren't just the stars of I Love Lucy. They were the gravitational center, the reason the show worked. Ricky and Lucy Ricardo were TV's original love and chaos duo, tearing through marriage tropes with Cuban flair and slapstick grace. But off-screen, they were married for real. And their marriage was no sitcom. The coincidence? Their on-screen chemistry so precise, so choreographed hid the fractures beneath. While audiences laughed at Lucy's schemes and Ricky's bluster, the actors themselves were navigating infidelity, ambition, and creative war zones. It was fiction, reflecting reality, and then distorting it. Millions watched their happy marriage each week, unaware that the smiles were sometimes just good acting. And then there's this I Love Lucy revolutionized television production. Multi-camera setups, live audiences, reruns, things we now take for granted, were pioneered by this real-life couple wrapped in sitcom packaging. Their divorce came after the show ended, but their legacy? Immortal. It's the perfect American contradiction. Love, money, fame, and just enough dysfunction to keep it interesting. And just like love needs light, so too did the modern world. Which brings us to a man who patented illumination and accidentally became its gatekeeper, the inventor of the light bulb and the patent. In 1879, Thomas Edison filed for the patent that would burn his name into the mythos of modernity, the incandescent light bulb. "Let there be light," he said, and the world obliged. Streets, homes, factories all flooded with artificial day. The coincidence? It wasn't entirely his to claim. He wasn't the first to invent it, just the first to lock it down with paperwork. Several inventors had already developed prototypes of electric light before Edison, but he perfected the filament, the longevity, the practicality, and crucially, the patent. Edison's genius, some argue, wasn't just in innovation, but in ownership. He didn't just light the bulb, he lit the system that would profit from it. This is where coincidence begins to smell like strategy. Edison, the Wizard of Menlo Park, often worked in parallel with others, then outpaced them with the force of legal filings and corporate momentum. The result? A man remembered as the father of light, while others flickered out in the shadows of his legend. But that's how history works. It crowns the loudest, the most litigious, the best at telling their version of events. Speaking of heads and how easily they roll in historical memory, the next tale flashes forward or backward to another king, another execution, and a guillotine's distant cousin. The king who lost his head and the French Revolution. Long before Louis XVI took his final breath beneath the blade in Paris, there was Charles I of England executed in 1649 by his own people. It wasn't a guillotine that ended him, but an axe. Different tool. Same symbolism. A king, stripped of divine right, brought low by his subjects. His death was one of history's original "we're done with monarchy" moments. Now, jump ahead to 1793. Another king, another execution. But this time, the French perfected the process, making it clinical, mechanical, democratic. The guillotine wasn't just a tool, it was a statement. Swift, equalizing, merciless. The coincidence lies in the symmetry. Two monarchies, two revolutions, two severed heads separated by time, united by outrage. The echoes of Charles I's fall rippled into France a century and a half later, as if the script had already been written. And it didn't end monarchy. It just changed its costume. Both kings became martyrs to their supporters, tyrants to their enemies, and cautionary tales to everyone else. The blade falls the same, regardless of the century. But sometimes, the knife cuts through the airwaves, instead sparking panic not with blood, but with static. Welcome to the night the aliens invaded, by accident. The writer of The War of the Worlds and the radio broadcast. H.G. Wells wrote The War of the Worlds in 1898, a brutal little tale of Martian invaders casually dismantling human civilization with heat rays and alien arrogance. It was science fiction's version of colonial payback. What if we got invaded? Fast forward 40 years. Orson Welles, theatrical wunderkind with a voice dipped in molasses, adapts the story into a radio drama. But here's the kicker, he frames it like a news broadcast. And America, already on edge from war jitters and economic misery, believes it. People flee towns, churches fill, guns are loaded. Martians, it turns out, are less scary than imagination. The coincidence is both hilarious and terrifying. Two men named Wells, well separated by time, united by narrative, accidentally collaborated across the decades to manufacture one of history's greatest hoaxes. The book was fiction. The broadcast, a mirror. It's a perfect storm of names, formats, and timing. And it reminds us that fear doesn't need a spaceship, just a good story, and a voice that sounds like it knows the truth. And speaking of cinematic tricks, the next tale involves scrolling text, space operas, and the fine art of stealing inspiration in broad daylight. The Star Wars opening crawl and the text of Flash Gordon. Before a single lightsaber was lit or a single Death Star exploded, Star Wars opened with a crawl. Yellow text sliding into the void, paired with an operatic blast of orchestral drama. It became iconic, immediately imitated, parodied, and burned into cinematic language. But the true origin of that crawl? Not space. Saturday morning television. Enter Flash Gordon, the serialized space adventure from the 1930s that featured opening scrolls designed to catch viewers up on the story. They were blunt, pulpy, and charmingly low budget. George Lucas grew up on them, ate them for breakfast, and when it came time to build his own galaxy far, far away, he borrowed the form wholesale. The crawl wasn't homage, it was resurrection. The coincidence lies in the unlikely immortality of that format. A throwaway device from a campy black and white serial ends up resurrected in the biggest sci-fi franchise in history. 2 eras, 2 galaxies, 1 gimmick, and somehow, it works. It's a reminder that the future often arrives dressed in the robes of the past. Even the most advanced universes begin with a little borrowed magic. And as long as we're borrowing legacies, let's meet the woman whose smile launched 1,000 theories and still won't tell us what she's thinking. The painting and the smile. She's not laughing, not smirking, not posing. The Mona Lisa just is. That half smile has been scrutinized for centuries, pulled apart by psychologists, artists, conspiracy theorists, and bored tourists. Painted sometime between 1503 and 1519, Leonardo da Vinci's masterpiece refuses to commit to a single emotion. That's the trick. That's the coincidence. Depending on the angle, she seems amused, coy, bored, smug, sad. Her expression shifts with your perspective, a 500-year-old optical illusion embedded in paint and wood. Da Vinci, the original Renaissance multitasker, didn't just create a portrait. He created an emotional Rorschach test, and it wasn't even titled Mona Lisa by him. That name came later, like the rest of the mythology that clings to her. The coincidence? Her facial ambiguity reflects the human condition with eerie precision. We're drawn to what we can't decode. Her smile isn't just mysterious, it's interactive. Each viewer sees something different, revealing more about themselves than about her. It's not just a painting, it's a trap. A psychological booby trap disguised as art. And if cities too can wear masks, let's talk about the twin metropolises that carved their names along riverbanks, both flowing with history, power, and a fair amount of irony. The twin cities and their rivers. Rome has the Tiber, London has the Thames. 2 cities, 2 rivers, and 1,000 years of imperial ego between them. The Tiber runs lazy and brown past ruins and saints. The Thames cuts through London like a liquid scar, dragging stories behind it like a barge full of secrets. The coincidence isn't just that these rivers shaped great capital cities, how eerily their roles mirror each other. Both rivers became the arteries of empires, flowing with trade, conquest, plague, and poetry. Both cities grew from their banks like mold on history's sandwich. Each river witnessed the rise of republics and monarchs, the fall of tyrants, the silt of civilization accumulating in every eddy. But they're more than metaphors. The Tiber flooded Rome into submission. The Thames choked London with fog and corpses. Each river turned city into legend, not by nourishing, but by testing. Rome's river gave us Caesar's crossing. London's gave us Jack the Ripper's fog. And somehow, these waters still flow, still carry tourists, still smell vaguely of empire. Which brings us, neatly enough, to another figure who knew how to work a Crow-done Dickensian author, one spectral holiday tale, and the original live book tour. The author of A Christmas Carol and his public readings. Charles Dickens wasn't just a writer. He was a one-man theater company, a Victorian rock star with a quill and a penchant for over-describing fog. By the time A Christmas Carol was published in 1843, he had already built a reputation as a social critic with a flair for the melodramatic. But it wasn't just the story that caught fire, it was Dickens himself, reading it aloud, over and over, to packed houses. In an era before microphones or movie trailers, he was the trailer. The coincidence? He didn't just write Scrooge's transformation, he performed it, channeling every ghost, every cackle, every humbug, with evangelical zeal. Audiences wept, fainted, stood in ovation. Dickens essentially invented the live author reading as an emotional experience, one where the man behind the story became the story. And maybe that's the spooky irony. The man who gave us a tale of supernatural reckoning spent decades reliving it night after night, haunting himself with the very ghosts he conjured. By the end of his life, those performances had drained him. He died with his sentences echoing in the halls he once filled. And from the echo of revolution to the echo of a gunshot, Russia's monarchy met its own chilling final sentence, delivered not by ghosts, but by revolutionaries, the last Tsar of Russia and the first communist leader. Nicholas II didn't just lose a throne, he lost a world. When the Russian Revolution boiled over, it didn't simply depose a monarch, it erased an entire class, an entire era, an entire illusion of divine rule. The Tsar, his wife, his children all, shot in a basement by Bolsheviks in 1918. It was less a trial than a punctuation mark. And then came Lenin, the man who filled the vacuum. If Nicholas was the ghost of feudalism, Lenin was the sharp-toothed prophet of the New World Order. Communism, in all its grim certainty, rose from the ashes of the Romanovs. The first modern socialist state was born on the same soil where czars once played chess with human lives. The coincidence? Nicholas was executed just as Lenin's Soviet experiment was gaining traction. One ideology fell as another ascended, no overlap, no handoff, just a clean, cold rupture. The old guard didn't just die, it was vaporized, and the family portrait, with Anastasia's ghost looming in legend, became a symbol of lost innocence or just revisionist fantasy. From crowns to commissars in one gunshot. And speaking of unlikely ascents, one fictional captain did what no czar ever managed. He left the earth entirely boldly going where no actor had gone before. The actor who played Captain Kirk and the real-life space enthusiast. William Shatner was never supposed to be iconic. He overacted. He paused in weird places. He turned Captain Kirk into a cultural punchline and, yet, somehow, a legend. Star Trek wasn't a ratings giant when it aired. It was a cult curiosity. But Kirk? He became the prototype for every sci-fi hero that followed. Decisive, arrogant, vaguely romantic with green women. A space cowboy with Shakespearean inflection. But the real twist came decades later. In 2021, Shatner, then 90 years old, boarded a Blue Origin flight and actually went to space for 11 minutes. Suborbital, sure but real space. Where the stars aren't painted backdrops and there's no stage crew waiting between takes. The coincidence? Fiction became autobiography. A man who spent his career pretending to command the cosmos finally touched it. And instead of triumphant monologues, Shatner returned, humbled, emotional, altered. He described the trip not in terms of adventure, but of mourning, of Earth's fragility, of life's terrifying smallness. Kirk went up, Shatner came down changed. And so we descend, from the vacuum of space to the sugar-plum chaos of a ballet that flopped at first, before pirouetting into immortality. The composer of The Nutcracker and its initial reception. Pyotr Ilyich Tchaikovsky did not write The Nutcracker expecting to create a global Christmas empire. In fact, he wasn't even sure it would work. Premiering in 1892, The Nutcracker Ballet was met with a polite but distinctly unenthusiastic shrug. Critics found it childish, the dancing too sugary, the plot flimsy. Tchaikovsky, for all his talent, had crafted something that was seen as beneath him, more decorative than dramatic. The coincidence is in the aftermath. What began as a lukewarm seasonal ballet became the sound of December. Somewhere between the Sugar Plum Fairy's tinkling theme and the Waltz of the Flowers, the world flipped its opinion. The very elements that critics mocked its whimsy, its lightness, its dreamlike unreality became its triumph. It was America, not Russia, that resurrected it decades later, rebranding the Nutcracker as a holiday ritual. Now it funds ballet companies, clogs theater schedules, and lives rent-free in the cultural consciousness. Tchaikovsky's failure became his most lucrative success. And from the moonlit snow of fantasy to the moon dust of reality, we turn to a rock, a flag, and a mission that made history then got sliced up and handed out like cosmic fruitcake. The Apollo 11 mission and the moon rock. When Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin landed on the moon in July 1969, they didn't just plant a flag, they scooped up souvenirs. Nearly 50 pounds of moon rocks, to be precise chunks of ancient, lifeless mystery bagged and tagged by men in vacuum suits. The mission was a victory for science, yes, but also for symbolism. Earth had reached out and touched its celestial twin. The most poetic twist? Some of those moon rocks didn't go to museums or labs. They were given as gifts to every U.S. state and to over 130 nations. A small gray sliver of the cosmos, gifted like a diplomatic fruitcake. Imagine being handed a rock older than life, itself wrapped in a velvet box with a plaque from the president. The coincidence lies in the contrast. The most expensive, dangerous, technically audacious expedition in human history ended with polite gifts to world leaders who likely placed them next to their other ceremonial paperweights. But that's what humans do with the sublime. We domesticate it, display it in glass. And while some art is stuck on pedestals, others are known by the wrong name entirely, like a stern woman in black who became America's mother by mistake. The painting of Whistler's Mother and its title. The painting is called Arrangement in Gray and Black Number 1, but no one calls it that. Instead, it's Whistler's Mother, an icon of maternal dignity, stoic patience, and Protestant restraint. The painting has become shorthand for traditional values, despite the fact that James McNeill Whistler wasn't exactly known for tradition. The real title tells the story better. An arrangement, not a portrait, not a homage. An experiment in form and balance. Whistler was more interested in harmony than biography. His mother was a subject, yes, his actual mother, but the point wasn't her identity. It was her stillness, her structure, her grayscale gravity. The coincidence? A deeply personal subject turned into an abstract study, only to be embraced by the public as the ultimate symbol of motherhood. It's like Whistler painted a fugue, and the world heard a lullaby. His minimalist intentions were rewritten by sentiment, and now the image is inseparable from that misinterpretation. And sometimes, that's how legacy works, by accident, by mislabeling, by public consensus. But not every woman gets to be immortalized in oil. Some take to the skies, only to vanish into mist and myth, leaving maps uncolored and questions unanswered. The first woman to fly solo across the Atlantic and her disappearance, Amelia Earhart, was already a legend before she disappeared. In 1932, she flew solo across the Atlantic Ocean, becoming the first woman to do so and only the second person ever after Charles Lindbergh. She did it in a plane that rattled like a tin can in a hurricane, over an ocean that swallowed ships whole. No GPS, no satellite tracking. Just maps, instinct, and steel nerves. The flight was a triumph of determination over odds. The coincidence? 5 years later, in 1937, Earhart vanished over the Pacific while attempting to fly around the world. The first woman to conquer the Atlantic solo would become aviation's most famous mystery, a pioneer who charted new airspace only to become permanently lost in it. Her last radio transmissions were garbled, uncertain. She and navigator Fred Noonan were never found. Not a scrap of plane, not a sliver of gear. Just empty ocean and an echo of possibility. What begins as victory ends in vanishing. The sky gave her fame, then took her away like it couldn't decide whether to crown her or consume her. And while she soared into mystery, another voice actress plummeted into unexpected horror, switching from a cartoon rebel to a tiny, plastic killer. The Simpsons actor, and her role in a classic horror film. Nancy Cartwright is the unmistakable voice of Bart Simpson, the eternal 10-year-old, with a slingshot in his back pocket and a catchphrase for every occasion. Her voice is part of the American subconscious. But years before she became the mouthpiece of mischief, she took on a very different role, or rather, lent her voice to something that doesn't say, "Eat my shorts," but something far, far more chilling. In 1988's Child's Play, Cartwright provided early uncredited voice work during production for Chucky's demonic doll, with a soul full of murder and a face like a melted toy clown. While her recordings didn't make the final cut, her eerie involvement in the film's creation lingers like a haunted afterthought. The coincidence? The woman who gave life to America's most lovable animated delinquent briefly intersected with the creation of one of horror's most terrifying toys. Two characters stuck in perpetual childhood. One throws chalkboard erasers, the other stabs people with kitchen knives. Voice acting, after all, is transformation. But sometimes, it's also a contradiction. And speaking of contradictions, our next figure was a royal icon loved for her beauty, hunted by politics, and undone not by her crown, but by an anarchist with a sharpened file. The unlucky Empress and her assassination. Empress Elizabeth of Austria, better known as Sisi, was the kind of royal that fairy tales get wrong. Stunning, poetic, melancholic, was adored by the public but suffocated by court life. She hated pomp, loathed etiquette, and spent most of her reign in exile from her own crown, riding horses and penning diary entries about her spiritual decay. Then came 1898. Geneva. A random anarchist named Luigi Lucchini, searching for any royal target he could find, stumbled upon Sisi. He didn't even know it was her at first. But fate or something darker offered her up. He stabbed her with a sharpened file. She didn't even realize she'd been mortally wounded until it was too late. A corset had concealed the blood. The coincidence? A woman who spent her life trying to disappear, who avoided court, ducked duties, evaded public appearances, was assassinated in the one rare moment she stepped into public view. Sisi died not because of politics, but because she was simply there. Her death was random, meaningless, and yet profoundly symbolic. The empire that couldn't hold her in life made her a martyr in death. And now, from monarchy to Mercury, where another queen reigned, but this time from a stage, with stadiums as their court. 33 twists in, and we've barely scratched the surface. Time, apparently, is as tangled as these coincidences. If your curiosity's still intact, or beautifully broken, now's a good time to hit that subscribe button before history throws another curveball. And seriously, where are you watching from? And what ungodly hour is it? Are you midnight scrolling in Melbourne or procrastinating in Prague? Drop it in the comments. We're mapping this mystery in real time. The band, Queen, and the British monarchy. Queen, a rock band that roared louder than the British Empire itself, led by a frontman who made Buckingham Palace look tame. Freddie Mercury didn't just sing detonated. With a vocal range like a missile and a stage presence that made gladiators blush, he turned arenas into cathedrals of defiance. But here's the twist. They named themselves Queen, Bold, Regal, Irreverent. It wasn't iron, it was challenge. British, yes, but not bowing to the throne becoming it. And yet, by some delightful historical loop, Queenth Band ended up performing for Queenth Monarch, Live Aid, 1985. Then again in 2002, for the Queen's Golden Jubilee. Freddie Mercury, long gone by then, was honored in spirit. Brian May played God Save the Queen from the roof of Buckingham Palace. Loud, electric, absurd. The coincidence is cosmic. A band that once flirted with the monarchy as satire ended up soundtracking its ceremonies. Rebels turned royal soundtrack. Rock turned ritual. And just as Queen's music echoed through palaces, another Englishman's dark fantasies echoed from muddy trenches, birthing a world of rings, monsters, and moral twilight born of real war. The author of Lord of the Rings and World War I, J.R.R. Tolkien, didn't need to imagine Mordor. He fought in it. Or rather, in its real-world equivalent, the trenches of World War I, mud, blood, gas, rats, the Somme, where friends vanished mid-sentence and landscapes were reduced to craters and wire. Tolkien, a young officer, survived by inches. But something followed him home, something dark. The coincidence is not subtle. Read The Lord of the Rings, and you'll hear the war, the hopeless odds, the weary fellowship, the heavy cost of victory. Frodo and Sam aren't just hobbits, they're foot soldiers. And Mordor? A scorched, poisoned wasteland crawling with metal and madness. It's not fantasy, it's memory, stylized and repackaged. Tolkien never said his work was an allegory, but trauma has a way of leaking through the ink. His epic wasn't just a story about good versus evil, it was about survival, about carrying a burden no one else can understand, about wounds that never fully heal. And speaking of apocalyptic visions, another writer once imagined a weapon so terrible it would redefine war decades before science made it real. The man who predicted the atomic bomb. H.G. Wells, the same man who gave us Martians and time machines, once dreamed up something more terrifying: atomic bombs. In his 1914 novel, The World Set Free, he described futuristic weapons that unleashed massive city-destroying explosions. He even called them atomic bombs. This was before the theory of nuclear fission had even taken shape, before Hiroshima, before Oppenheimer. The coincidence is unnerving. Wells wasn't just speculating, he was eerily accurate. He imagined not just the weapon, but its effect on politics, war, and human psychology. The bomb as civilization's inflection point, the thing we build to end ourselves. Decades later, scientists working on the Manhattan Project read Wells's work. Some were inspired, others spooked. The line between imagination and reality blurred. A sci-fi prophecy became engineering blueprints. Wells, the prophet of progress, inadvertently predicted its undoing. And just like that, we slide from apocalypse to absurdity, from theoretical destruction to actual television, where another fictional genius spent his time collecting cereal box cars instead of grappling with moral collapse. The Seinfeld character and the actor's real-life hobby. Jerry Seinfeld, the character, was a neurotic, serial-obsessed stand-up comedian living in a pristine New York apartment. Jerry Seinfeld, the man, was also a neurotic, serial-obsessed stand-up comedian living in a pristine New York apartment. The overlap was uncanny. But one particular quirk carried through from fiction to reality so precisely it blurs the line between scripted television and autobiography: cars. In real life, Seinfeld is a car obsessive. Not in the abstract sense. He owns one of the largest collections of Porsches in the world. Rare ones, fast ones. Ones that only people with multi-camera syndication deals can afford. And on Seinfeld, there are constant quiet nods to his obsession. Parking spots become battlegrounds. Car maintenance is a recurring dilemma. Even comedians in Cars Getting Coffee, his later project, feels like an extended punchline born from a million off-screen car rants. The coincidence lies in how seamlessly the character absorbed the actor's personal fixation. Usually, the actor disappears into the role. Here, the role retrofitted itself to accommodate the actor. It's a sitcom loop, a narcissistic Ouroboros of car talk and coffee. And while Seinfeld may have driven in circles, another artist's path was far more direct toward an ear, a razor, and a very poorly timed romantic implosion. The artist who cut off his ear. Again. Vincent van Gogh is the poster child for the tortured artist cliché, and for good reason. His life was a slow-motion collapse of mental anguish, obsession, and breathtaking color. But nothing defines his legend more than that one moment in Arles, 1888, when he sliced off part of his left earlobe with a razor during a breakdown. The story has become myth. The painter, the prostitute, the ear wrapped like a Christmas gift. Rachel, the recipient of the bloody bundle, was reportedly horrified. And yet, her name is now forever tied to that surreal footnote in art history. The coincidence isn't just the ear, it's how that act of violence, that impulsive self-harm, became the accidental gateway to fame. Van Gogh sold almost nothing while alive. But after the ear incident, after the asylum, after the rumors and the madness, his art became unignorable. The man who mutilated himself out of despair inadvertently etched himself into immortality. It's the cruelest irony. The more he suffered, the more his work flourished. And speaking of contradictions, how about a musical tribute to heroism that was originally meant for a conqueror until its composer realized he'd been duped by power? The composer who wrote the Eroica Symphony and Napoleon. Ludwig van Beethoven admired Napoleon Bonaparte, not the emperor, the revolutionary, the man who defied monarchy and chaos to become a symbol of order through ambition. When Beethoven began writing his Third Symphony, he intended it as a dedication to Napoleon, a musical monument to liberty, progress, and the reordering of a broken continent. Then Napoleon crowned himself emperor. Beethoven, upon hearing the news, allegedly tore the title page in half. The dedication was revoked. The idealist became a realist. The Eroica Symphony, once a tribute to one man, became a requiem for every ideal betrayed by power. The coincidence is layered. A piece born in revolution ends up echoing betrayal. A composer who went deaf poured into music the roar of political disillusionment. The Eroica was no longer about Napoleon. It was about the fall of every would-be savior who touches the crown and forgets the people. It is still one of Beethoven's most profound works, ambitious, chaotic, yearning, not a tribute, a warning. And warnings aren't always heeded, especially when they come from doctors about the weather. Which brings us to the next American president, whose tenure was shorter than a cold, but deadlier than a blizzard. The first president to die in office, and the length of his term. William Henry Harrison holds a dubious honor in American history, the president with the shortest term, 31 days. Not even enough time to unpack the curtains in the Oval Office. The story goes that during his inauguration in 1841, Harrison, eager to prove his robust old man energy, gave the longest inaugural address ever, over 8,000 words in freezing rain. No coat, no hat, just pride, verbosity, and a bad decision. He caught a cold. The cold became pneumonia. The pneumonia became a funeral. The coincidence? He was elected on a platform of toughness, a war hero, a frontier man, a living embodiment of American ruggedness. And yet, what took him out wasn't battle, it was weather. He survived real war, only to be undone by his own speech and the sky above it. Even stranger, his death triggered a constitutional crisis. No one was sure if the vice president became acting president or the president. That debate eventually led to the 25th Amendment, ironically giving Harrison, through death, more long-term influence than he ever wielded alive. And while Harrison's presidency was vanishingly brief, a television show once cast 7 people on an island with nothing but coconut radios and suspiciously good hair. It wasn't where it was sitcom survival. The Gilligan's Island Castaways and Their Professions. 7 castaways. 1 tiny shipwreck. An island no map can find. Gilligan's Island debuted in 1964 as a goofy sitcom, but it was hiding a bizarrely symbolic microcosm of American society beneath its coconut surface. The characters? A weirdly deliberate cross-section of civilization. The wealthy elite, Mr. and Mrs. Howell, the intellectual, the professor, the entertainer, Ginger, the girl next door, Marianne, the authority figure, the skipper, and the everyman fool, Gilligan. Each castaway represented a social role. Together they built an accidental society out of bamboo, sarcasm, and occasional genius. The professor could make a radio from coconuts, but couldn't fix a boat. The Howells had money but no survival skills. And Gilligan? Always the cause of the problem and the heart of the solution. The coincidence? It's too perfectly allegorical. A crash course in class, power, and teamwork disguised as slapstick. A deserted island turned into a stage for America's post-war anxieties and fantasies. A comedy that accidentally mirrored sociology textbooks. And while they were lost at sea, another man was launching a very different kind of vessel powered by steam, ambition, and a distinctly American thirst for movement. The man who invented the first practical steamboat and his name. Robert Fulton didn't invent the steamboat. Not exactly. But he did make it practical and commercially unstoppable. In 1807, his North River steamboat, better known as the Clermont, successfully traveled up the Hudson River, changing transportation forever. Before Fulton, river travel was at the mercy of the current. After Fulton, the river answered to the engine. The name Fulton became synonymous with movement. A man whose invention didn't just move boats, it moved economies. Towns sprang up along rivers. Goods moved faster. The industrial pulse quickened. Steam was the new king. The coincidence? His name, Fulton, sounds like full-ton, a fitting legacy for a man whose invention would carry thousands of them. And though he wasn't the first to tinker with steam power, he was the first to make it work reliable, repeatable, commercial. That's the kind of success history remembers. And just as Fulton set his boat against the current, another man turned his pen toward tragedy, crafting a story of star-crossed love in a city that now sells the script as a tourist attraction. The playwright who wrote Romeo and Juliet and its setting. William Shakespeare could have set Romeo and Juliet anywhere, England, Greece, an imaginary nowhere. But he chose Verona, small Italian city most English theatergoers had never seen. A place whose name rolled off the tongue like wine, and by doing so, he immortalized it. One city, 2 names, infinite heartbreak. The coincidence is how thoroughly Verona absorbed this fiction. The city today leans into its Shakespearean inheritance with unnerving devotion. Juliet's Balcony is a popular tourist site even though Juliet never existed and the building was constructed long after the play was written. Letters to Juliet arrive from around the world, asking advice from a ghost who never lived, for love problems that never needed a stage. But perhaps the real coincidence is how a fictional tale of impulsive teenagers and feuding families became the universal script for romantic doom. The words are Shakespeare's, the pain is ours. And while the bard gave voice to doomed lovers, another voice would later echo through galaxies booming with paternal power as both the villain of the stars and the lion of the savannah. The Star Wars character, voiced by the same actor as a famous lion. James Earl Jones. One voice, 2 worlds. In Star Wars, he is Darth Vader, breathy, gloved embodiment of fallen promise. A man whose voice alone could make grown Jedi cry. And in The Lion King, He is Mufasate, a regal patriarch, with a mane full of wisdom and a voice full of thunder. 2 roles, same vocal cords, very different father figures. The coincidence is cosmic. In one universe, he plays a father who redeems himself through his son. In another, a father whose death defines his son's journey. In both, the weight of legacy falls like a stone. Jones's voice doesn't just narrate pronounces destiny, he is fate. Kids who feared Vader grew up listening to Mufasa, and sometimes they didn't realize they were the same man. It's a generational voice print. Power, compassion, threat, loss compressed into every syllable. And just as Jones voiced kings and tyrants, ancient Rome gave us a ruler who decided his horse deserved a seat in government. Because when satire meets politics, nothing says respect your leaders like a consul with hooves. The Roman emperor who made a horse a consul. Caligula, history's favorite lunatic in a toga-ruled Rome from AD 37 to 41. In just 4 years, he crammed more madness into one imperial reign than most dynasties manage in a century. The most enduring anecdote? He appointed his horse, Incitatus, to a consulship, or threatened to, or pretended to. The accounts are fuzzy, the intent murky, but the image? Immortal. Was it satire? A joke at the Senate's expense? A jab at the idea that any 4-legged creature could do their job better? Maybe. Or maybe Caligula really thought Incitatus had leadership potential. After all, the horse had a marble stable, a golden trough, and guards to ensure his sleep wasn't disturbed. More perks than most human officials ever got. The coincidence? Caligula ruled during a time when Rome's foundations were cracking. Decadence, corruption, and spectacle ruled the day. And here was a literal beast of burden elevated to political office, in ironic mirror to every unqualified ruler before and since. It's the kind of story that feels too absurd to be true, and too true to be absurd. And if absurdity had a soundtrack, it might sound like the dark, spiraling pulse of madness set to music crafted by a band that understood time, space, and mental collapse. The band that released The Dark Side of the Moon and its themes. When Pink Floyd released The Dark Side of the Moon in 1973, they didn't just drop an album, they detonated a cultural monument. With tracks like Time, Money, and Brain Damage, they carved out a sonic exploration of mortality, insanity, and the crushing gears of modern life. It's not just music, it's diagnosis. The coincidence lies in timing and resonance. The early 1970s were peak disillusionment. Vietnam, Nixon, oil crises, space travel. The idea that humanity had unlocked the universe while simultaneously unraveling itself. The Dark Side of the Moon landed squarely in that existential tension. It wasn't just a soundtrack, it was prophecy, pressed into vinyl. Even more eerie? The album's iconic prism coverlight fractured into color became a symbol of clarity during chaos, and despite its deeply personal themes, it connected with millions. Why? Because its madness was shared. It stayed on the Billboard charts for years. Literally. As if the album refused to let go until the world finally absorbed its warning. And all the while, in another timeline of history, wires were buzzing not with music, but messages, as another revolution surged across American soil. The American Civil War and the telegraph. The American Civil War was a bloody, mud-soaked, musket-blasted disaster of a war, but also a technological milestone. For the first time in warfare, real-time communication was possible across distances thanks to the telegraph. Morse code turned generals into chess players and soldiers into pawns moved by electric pulses. Abraham Lincoln became the first wired president. He'd walk into the War Department's telegraph office like it was his second cabinet, reading dispatches, composing replies, treating it like a 19th century version of the Situation Room. Battles were monitored in near real time. orders issued without waiting for couriers on horseback. The coincidence? A war fought with 18th century weaponry was simultaneously directed with 20th century communication, bayonets and telegrams, smoke signals and electric pulses. It was a war with one foot in the past and one hand on the future. And the irony: faster communication meant faster death, misinterpreted orders, conflicting commands. Speed doesn't always bring clarity. And while men relayed war across wires, another artist was shaping time through surrealism, bending clocks like dreams, all while twirling the most absurd facial hair ever attached to a genius. The artist who painted. The persistence of memory and his mustache. Salvador Dalí never believed in subtlety. He painted melting clocks, impossible landscapes, and insects that felt like Freudian nightmares in oil. But just as iconic as the persistence of memory, his 1931 masterpiece of soft time was the mustache, waxed, vertical, absurd. A mustache that looked like it was trying to flee his face, one wiry strand at a time. The coincidence isn't just visual. His mustache was its own brand, curated, crafted, and endlessly photographed. But like his art, it wasn't decoration, it was statement. Time is an illusion. Reality is performance. Why should facial hair behave? And yet, the persistence of memory offered something quietly profound beneath the surrealism. A meditation on decay, on time's liquefaction, on memory as a dripping mirage. Painted during the rise of fascism, the piece was less about dreams and more about dread. The mustache may have twitched with humor, but the painting didn't smile. Dalí performed absurdity so convincingly, the world almost forgot he was dead serious. His clocks drooped, his fame never did. And in a different kind of cartoon absurdity, a yellow family would soon tackle the same themes of madness, war, and music, with a fictional boy band and a perfectly engineered pop machine. The Simpsons episode featuring a fictional boy band and the real music industry. In 2001, The Simpsons aired an episode titled New Kids on the Block. It featured Bart and his friends becoming pop stars in a boy band called the Party Posse. But there was a twist. The band wasn't real. Not just in the cartoon sense, it was manufactured by the US Navy as a recruitment tool, using subliminal messaging hidden in their catchy lyrics. It was a satire, a joke. And yet was it? The coincidence lies in the uncomfortable overlap between satire and reality. Around that time, the real music industry was increasingly engineered. Boy bands were assembled like IKEA furniture. Personalities were tested, choreographies drilled, and image came before talent. The Party Posse was fictional, but the machinery that made them was terrifyingly accurate. Even more surreal? The episode aired before 9/11s, before the explosion of military entertainment crossover culture, before propaganda started wearing eyeliner and singing in harmony. The Simpsons, as usual, was ahead of its time, accidentally predicting the direction of pop culture and the strange fusion of warfare and entertainment. And speaking of people sent around the world to die for glory, how about a globe-circling voyage led by a man who didn't live to see it completed? The explorer who circumnavigated the globe and died along the way. Ferdinand Magellan set out in 1519 to prove the world was round and, not just in theory, he wanted to go all the way around it. Sponsored by Spain, obsessed with spice routes, and absolutely willing to sail into the unknown, Magellan led a fleet across oceans no European had mapped. 3 years later, in 1522, the journey succeeded. But Magellan didn't. He died in the Philippines, stabbed in the face by islanders who weren't thrilled with the whole plant this flag and bow before my cross routine. His body was never recovered. Yet his expedition, now captained by Juan Sebastián Elcano, completed the mission. The first circumnavigation of the Earth was credited to a man who wasn't alive to celebrate it. The coincidence? The man most famous for going around the globe didn't finish the circle. History gave him credit, even though death wrote him out of the final act. It's like running a marathon, collapsing at mile 24, and still being handed the trophy. It's the paradox of ambition. You can chart the course, take the risk, light the fuse and still not live to see the fireworks. And fireworks, of course, are nothing compared to the tragic explosions behind the curtain of Hollywood's brightest smile. The actress who played Dorothy and her later struggles. Judy Garland was 17 when she slipped on ruby slippers and wandered down a technicolor road to cinematic immortality. The Wizard of Oz, 1939, made her a legend, a voice that could shatter hearts, a face that defined innocence. Dorothy was everything America wanted to believe about it: hopeful, resilient, and dreaming of home. But Judy's real life was no fairy tale. The coincidence lies in the cruel symmetry between her most famous role and her real fate. On screen, Dorothy wanted to go home. Off screen, Garland never really found one. Pushed into stardom as a child, stuffed with diet pills and sleeping tablets by the studio, she lived in a haze of performance and exhaustion. The industry that made her also broke her. She died in 1969, alone in a London bathroom. Addiction, overwork, fragility. And yet, her voice still floats, her smile still beams. The girl who sang Over the Rainbow never quite got there, but somehow carried the rest of us part way. And if that isn't the ultimate Hollywood illusion, maybe the next inventor's story is a man who revolutionized agriculture, but accidentally strengthened the very system he thought he'd simplify. The inventor of the cotton gin and its unintended consequence. Eli Whitney's cotton gin, patented in 1793, was supposed to solve a problem. It did, just not the one we like to talk about. Designed to separate cotton fibers from seeds faster and more efficiently, the invention revolutionized agriculture in the American South. What used to take hours by hand could now be done in minutes. Cotton output exploded. Southern planters rejoiced. Progress, right? Not quite. The grim coincidence is that Whitney's invention, which many assumed would reduce the need for slave labor by streamlining production, did the exact opposite. Cotton became so profitable that demand for slaves skyrocketed. Plantations expanded. Human lives became even more entwined in economic machinery. So, the cotton gin created by a man from Massachusetts, who later became a staunch advocate of mechanization, ended up fueling the very system of bondage his invention was supposed to replace. Efficiency became dependency. Progress became regression. The South didn't modernize, it doubled down. And there's a bitter footnote. Whitney made very little money from the cotton gin due to patent disputes, while the industry it transformed became grotesquely wealthy. From mechanical irony to maritime tragedy, our next story explores how the creator of a fictional monster lost her real-life love to the indifferent arms of the sea. The writer of Frankenstein and her husband's drowning. Mary Shelley invented one of the most enduring monsters in literary history. Frankenstein's creature, stitched together from corpses, jolted to life by electricity, doomed by abandonment. But what many forget is that Shelley's own life was stitched together with grief, and nowhere is that clearer than in the death of her husband, Percy Bysshe Shelley. In 1822, Percy, poet, radical, romantic, drowned in a boating accident off the Italian coast. His body, found days later, was barely recognizable. The only identifying items were a book of Keats's poetry and Mary's own writings in his pockets. The coincidence is macabre. The woman who wrote about reanimation and the horror of unnatural resurrection lost her love to nature's cold indifference. And when his body was cremated on the beach, his heart, according to lore, refused to burn. Mary kept it wrapped in silk, a relic of love and loss, as gothic as anything in her fiction. Frankenstein wasn't just fantasy. It was forewarning. A vision of grief, stitched into myth. And while Mary captured death in prose, another sci-fi universe found its icy muse, not in metaphor but in a real frozen wasteland that doubled as a galaxy far, far away. The Star Wars planet Hoth and the real place. When The Empire Strikes Back opens, we're thrust into Hoth, a frozen planet of swirling snow, howling winds, and bitter desolation. It's where the rebellion hides. It's where Luke nearly dies. And it's where one of cinema's most memorable ambushes unfolds, complete with giant, mechanical camels. But here's the cold coincidence. Hoth wasn't a digital backdrop. It was real. Those scenes were filmed in Finse, Norway, a location so brutally cold and remote that even the film crew nearly mutinied. When the blizzard hit, they didn't cancel production, they just shoved Mark Hamill outside into the whiteout, turned the camera on, and called it acting. What's bizarre is how perfectly the location matched the fictional world. The snow was real, the isolation, the danger, the sense of inhospitable otherness, it all came straight from nature. A galaxy far, far away looked suspiciously like Earth at its most unforgiving. In trying to depict alien adversity, Star Wars stumbled into a landscape that needed no enhancement. The frontier was already here. And from frosted alien worlds to poisoned cups, the next tale follows a philosopher whose final lesson came not from the mind, but from a hemlock chalice. The philosopher who died by hemlock. Socrates wasn't just a philosopher. He was a walking contradiction wrapped in robes, forever asking questions that annoyed everyone from students to statesmen. His method asking, probing, undermining, made him the original intellectual troll, and in 399 BC, it got him killed. Officially, for corrupting the youth and impiety. Unofficially, for refusing to shut up. The coincidence is poetic. Socrates, who preached that an unexamined life is not worth living, was sentenced to death precisely because he examined everything. And his death wasn't dramatic. No lions, no crucifixion, just a cup of hemlock, a calm poison, taken quietly, surrounded by his students. The image is iconic. A man calmly sipping death like it's afternoon tea. His limbs go numb. He lies back. He talks philosophy until his voice fades. It's not martyrdom. It's principle embodied. And here's the eerie part. His death turned him into the exact kind of myth he rejected. A man of logic became a symbol, a story. From the shadows of ancient Athens, we move to another master of light and shadow, an artist who captured stillness in pearls, and whose use of silence made a single gaze unforgettable. The painter of Girl with a Pearl Earring and his use of light. Johannes Vermeer painted like he had a direct line to sunlight. His interiors glowed softly. His subjects seemed paused mid-thought. But none more so than Girl with a Pearl Earring. A young woman turned away, looking back, her mouth slightly open, her earring catching the light like a whispered secret. The coincidence lies in Vermeer's obscurity during his life versus his posthumous fame. He painted only about 3 dozen works. He died in debt, forgotten. But today, that girl with the pearl is as famous as the Mona Lisa, and all because of how he used light. Vermeer didn't just paint light, he sculpted with it, let it bounce off skin, fabric, glass. He understood that what's left, unsaid, what's dimmed, blurred, barely illuminated is what draws the eye. His Girl isn't smiling, she isn't posing, she exists, barely, entirely. And while Vermeer captured stillness, another woman also caught on film, this time with grapes up to her knees, taught America how to fall into a vat and still win hearts. The I Love Lucy episode and its grape stomping scene. An episode of I Love Lucy titled Lucy's Italian Movie aired, forever altering how America pictures winemaking. In it, Lucille Ball, playing the eternally scheming Lucy Ricardo, finds herself stomping grapes in a vat with a fiery local woman. What begins as a job quickly devolves into one of the most iconic brawls in sitcom history, feet flailing, purple stains flying, and Lucy, as always, hilariously overwhelmed. The coincidence? A scene meant as slapstick parody became the enduring image of old world tradition. Ask anyone how grapes are turned into wine, and many will unconsciously picture Lucille Ball's face covered in juice and shock. Comedy became cultural shorthand. A joke became a myth. Even stranger, the scene was filmed in complete improvisational chaos. Ball wasn't faking the struggle, she was genuinely surprised when her co-star didn't pull punches. The laughter, the chaos, it was real. And that's the power of the moment. An unscripted fight in a scripted world, broadcast into millions of homes, mistaken for truth. And speaking of rewriting time itself, our next story steps into the calendar and meets the Pope who had the nerve to fix time and start a century-long argument. The king who introduced the Gregorian calendar. Pope Gregory XIII did not invent time, but he did adjust it like a divine watchmaker correcting the universe's misalignment. In 1582, he introduced the Gregorian calendar to fix the slight but accumulating drift caused by the Julian calendar's miscalculation of the solar year. A few extra minutes per year doesn't seem like much until you realize it was throwing Easter way off schedule. And nothing upsets a 16th century pope like a misaligned resurrection. The coincidence is that to fix time, Gregory had to erase it. 10 whole days, gone. In countries that adopted the calendar immediately, the 4th of October was followed by the 15th of October. People rioted. They thought lives were being stolen. Rent was still due for those lost days. But here's the real kicker. Not everyone switched at once. Protestant countries, skeptical of anything papal, held out for decades, or even centuries. For a while, different parts of Europe were living in different times, literally. One continent, multiple realities. A calendar intended to bring order instead created temporary chaos because nothing messes with humans more than telling them their version of now is wrong. And while Gregory reshaped the calendar, another quiet observer reshaped literature without leaving her drawing room. The author of Pride and Prejudice and her limited travel. Jane Austen's novels have traveled the globe. She has been adapted, reimagined, recostumed, and recast more times than most monarchs. But Austen herself barely traveled at all. She lived a quiet life in the English countryside. Steventon, Bath, Chawton, small places where nothing exploded except dialogue and social expectations. The coincidence? From her parochial, restricted world, Austen captured the universal. Her characters navigate class, love, hypocrisy, and the tyranny of manners with such precision that readers from Tokyo to Texas feel personally indicted by Elizabeth Bennet's raised eyebrow. She observed human nature so well, you'd think she'd toured empires. But no, her passport would have been blank. She didn't need to travel. Everyone came to her. That's the irony. Austen's mobility was limited by gender, money, and health. But her reacher, psychological scalpel cut through geography, her small world birthed an eternal one. And while Austen's restraint was her weapon, another president's self-restraint gave birth to one of democracy's most sacred boundaries, the idea that power, like milk, should come with an expiration date. The first U.S. president and the two-term limit. George Washington could have been king. After leading the colonies to victory in the Revolutionary War, he was adored, trusted, and feared just enough. If he had wanted the throne, they likely would have handed it to him on a silver platter and then polished his boots with powdered wigs. But he didn't. Instead, he served 2 terms as the first president of the United States, then stepped down voluntarily. No scandal, no uprising, just retirement. A quiet, deliberate exit that said, "This job is temporary, and I'm not indispensable." The coincidence? By setting that precedent, Washington did something no constitution had yet codified. He established the 2-term limit not by law, but by personal decision. It wouldn't become official until the 22nd Amendment in 1951. That's over 150 years later. Every president afterward followed suit until FDR broke the pattern. But the cultural weight of Washington's self-limitation lingered. The founder of the nation also became its first example of how to let go of power. And while Washington faded into his farm, Another group of national treasures were about to implode at the height of their harmony, because even revolutions of sound have their breaking point. The band that broke up at the height of their fame. In 1970, the Beatles broke up. It wasn't dramatic in the moment, no public meltdown, no explosive final show, just quiet legal filings and personal fissures made permanent. But the timing? That's where the coincidence lands with full force. The Beatles weren't fading. They weren't irrelevant. They were everywhere. Their final studio album, Abbey Road, was a masterpiece. The Let It Be film and album followed, dripping with tension but still wildly successful. They'd evolved from mop-topped heartthrobs into sonic architects, sprawling, spiritual, fractured geniuses. And then, gone. The coincidence is cruel and fascinating. Their creative peak coincided with their emotional nadir. The better the music got, the worse the relationships became. Like stars burning hottest just before collapse. Most bands fade. The Beatles didn't. They detonated. Each went solo. Some soared, some flailed. But none ever quite recaptured the magic they had when they were four heads bobbing behind microphones, arguing over lyrics and legacies. And as one artist painted the sky from within a padded room, the idea of too late and too beautiful would reach new heights in canvas, under sedation, and in the eyes of a man who saw the stars differently from everyone else. The artist who painted Starry Night and The Asylum. In 1889, Vincent van Gogh was admitted to the asylum at Saint Paul de Moselle in Saint-Rémy-de-Provence. His mind was fracturing. He'd already cut off part of his ear, lost friendships, and was battling fits of mental anguish that made the world seem too loud, too sharp, too much. And then, he painted The Starry Night. The coincidence? One of the most serene, iconic, emotionally resonant images in art history was painted by a man at his psychological breaking point. The swirls of the sky, the rolling hills, the church spire, it looks peaceful, transcendent, but it came from chaos. The painting wasn't a landscape Van Gogh saw. It was one he imagined, what he felt. The world, not as it was, but as it roared inside him. He painted it from memory, from inside an institution. The stars were real, but their glow was filtered through agony. And the irony? The painting was largely ignored during his lifetime. No applause. No sales. Just one more burst of brilliance from a man the world misunderstood. And while Van Gogh found his heaven in isolation, another fictional heaven would soon be gate-crashed by the least presidential of neighbors wearing flip-flops and bringing donuts. The Simpsons episode where Homer meets George H.W. Bush. In the 1996 episode, Two Bad Neighbors, The Simpsons did what they do best, turned suburban absurdity into political satire. When former President George H.W. Bush moves into the house across the street from Homer Simpson, neighborly decorum quickly collapses into pranks, brawls, and lawn-based vendettas. It's ridiculous, it's brilliant, it's American. The coincidence? George Bush had actually criticized The Simpsons in real life, once declaring that American families should be a lot more like the Waltons and a lot less like The Simpsons. The show responded not with a rebuttal, but with an episode that turned a former president into a cranky, pants-losing caricature. It was fictional revenge, satirical full circle. A cartoon that had been dismissed as lowbrow and corrosive managed to pull a former commander-in-chief into its orbit, and not gently. The episode worked because it knew the lines between fiction and fact had blurred. It was about neighbors, yes, but also about class, generation, and the soft war between order and chaos. And speaking of discovery, the next tale isn't about finding enemies but finding oceans, and the man who first saw the other side of the world and claimed it with a flag, the explorer who discovered the Pacific Ocean. In 1513, Vasco Núñez de Balboa crossed the Isthmus of Panama, scaled the mountains, and descended to a shimmering coastline none of his fellow Europeans had ever seen. It wasn't the Atlantic. It wasn't a bay. It was the other side. The Pacific Ocean. Vast, placid, unbroken. And by the rules of imperial logic, it was instantly his. Balboa, in an act of performative conquest, waded waist-deep into the surf and claimed the ocean for Spain like it was a castle or a corner lot. He named it the South Sea, having no idea how big it really was or what would come from that moment. The name would change. The consequences wouldn't. The coincidence? Balboa wasn't supposed to be famous. He was a fugitive escaping creditors, dodging debt, basically stowing away on history's timeline. Yet he became the man who first brought Europe face to face with the Pacific. The explorer who wasn't meant to explore. The accidental visionary. And just as he carved his name into maps, another man, fictional but iconic, would spend his life racing through maps of villains and martinis, only to earn a title and a cause far more noble in real life. The actor who played James Bond and his royal connection. Sir Roger Moore played James Bond with a raised eyebrow and a smirk that could defuse a nuclear bomb. He wasn't the grittiest Bond, or the coldest, but he was, arguably, the suavest. His Bond wore tuxedos like skin and cracked one-liners like knuckles. But off-screen, Moore was something else entirely. The coincidence is in the divergence. Bond was a killer. Moore was a humanitarian. After his acting career, Moore became a UNICEF Goodwill Ambassador, traveling the world to advocate for children's rights. He lobbied for vaccines, clean water, educate saving lives instead of taking them. Unlike Bond, he never held a Walther PPK, just a passport and a cause. Even more surreal? Moore's title of Sir came not for acting, but for his charity work. He played a fictional British heroine, then became a real one, knighted by the Queen. It's the rare case of a man whose fiction gave him a platform, and whose reality gave that platform purpose. And while Moore's actions hit notes of mercy, the next composer gave the world something far more dramatic, a chorus of angels crashing through history in a speedrun of divine inspiration. The composer of the Hallelujah Chorus, and its speed of composition. George Frederick Handel's Messiah is a cornerstone of sacred music. You've heard the Hallelujah Chorus, even if you think you haven't. It's in cathedrals, shopping malls, flash mobs, and movies. It is joy weaponized, music that feels like it descends from clouds on trumpets. But here's the wild part. Handel reportedly composed the entire oratorio in a feverish, near-manic sprint of about 3 to 4 weeks. Some say he barely ate or slept. One servant claimed to find him in tears, whispering, "I did think I did see all heaven before me." Whether apocryphal or not, the story stuck. The coincidence? A piece that feels eternal, crafted in days. Music that speaks of divine eternity, written under the pressure of time and exhaustion. The most famous Hallelujah in history was likely the product of stress, deadlines, and spiritual ecstasy, or maybe just one really strong cup of coffee. Either way, the result is clear. A work that has transcended its composer, its century, and even its intended audience. A lightning strike in the form of notation. And while Handel gave voice to angels, another woman gave voice to a sleepy southern town and accidentally changed America's moral compass forever. The author of To Kill a Mockingbird and her hometown. Harper Lee's To Kill a Mockingbird was set in Maycomb, Alabama, a place of dusty sidewalks, quiet tension, and smoldering injustice. The town feels so vivid, so authentic. You can smell the magnolias and taste the courtroom air, but Maycomb wasn't fictional. Not really. It was Monroeville, Harper Lee's actual hometown, barely disguised by a few changed syllables. The coincidence is thick with irony. The town that shaped her became the template for a national moral reckoning. Lee never published another book in her lifetime after Mockingbird. She didn't need to. One novel was enough to lay bare the rot beneath polite Southern civility. And it wasn't hypothetical. She watched it unfold from her own front porch. Her father was the inspiration for Atticus Finch. Her neighbors became characters. The people she grew up with, some of them nodded in agreement when the novel succeeded, never realizing they were the villains. Or, worse, they did realize. The story that exposed America's racial conscience was born from one small place, never meant to carry such weight. But it did. Quietly. Permanently. And while Maycomb's moral shadows loomed large, another master of suspense was crafting a different kind of fear-own, involving a bathroom, a knife, and a scream that echoed through generations. The film Psycho and the shower scene. Alfred Hitchcock didn't invent horror, but with Psycho, 1960, he gave it a knife and put it in your bathroom. The film was a psychological jackhammer low budget, black and white, and completely unprepared for how deep it would cut. And the shower scene? It's not just iconic. It's practically engraved in the collective psyche. But the coincidence that makes it truly unsettling is how little it shows. No visible nudity, barely any actual violence, just 78 camera angles, 52 rapid cuts, and a screeching violin score. The terror came from implication, from editing, from imagination. It was horror, born not from gore, but from rhythm and suggestion. The actress, Janet Leigh, reportedly never took another shower again, switching to baths for the rest of her life. Audiences were traumatized. Bathroom sales supposedly dipped. One scene shifted an entire culture's relationship with vulnerability. And the director? He never made another film quite like it, because he didn't need to. The scream had already been heard. But while Hitchcock orchestrated terror from shadows, another band, strange, mystical, and defiant, was channeling their own brand of occult energy into rock, rewriting the rules of what music could mean. The band, Led Zeppelin, and their mystical imagery. Led Zeppelin didn't just make music, they summoned storms. Every riff sounded like an incantation, every lyric like an ancient secret shouted through an amp. But beyond the sound, what set them apart was the look, the lore, the symbols. They were rock stars, yes, but also mystics, alchemists, weird prophets of electric thunder. The coincidence? Their obsession with the occult and mysticism mirrored the exact fears critics hurled at them. Satanic rumors, backward messages, symbols on album covers that no one could decipher because they invented them. They cultivated mystery and then found themselves haunted by it. Jimmy Page, the band's guitarist, bought Aleister Crowley's former mansion. The band was plagued with accidents, deaths, and eerie synchronicities. Whether coincidence or consequence, their myth fed itself. They didn't just play music, they built a mythology. And by the time Led Zeppelin IV dropped with Stairway to Heaven leading the charge, they were no longer just a band, they were a force. A force that, like all force eventually, burns too bright. But before the ashes came, the art. And while Zeppelin flirted with the mystical, another polymath from the Renaissance fused faith and science, painting not just souls, but blueprints for the modern world. The artist who painted The Last Supper and his scientific interests. Leonardo da Vinci was not content to be merely a genius. He had to be every kind of genius: artist, inventor, anatomist, engineer, dreamer. He painted The Last Supper in the late 1490s, capturing one of the most pivotal moments in Christian theology, with a table of frozen shock and whispered betrayal. Each apostle reacts differently. Each face is a study in psychology. But the coincidence? This towering religious painting, so often associated with divine mystery, was created by a man obsessed with earthly mechanisms. Da Vinci dissected cadavers. He studied hydraulics. He designed flying machines. His notebooks are filled with gears and wings and mirror writing. While painting the sacred, he was also sketching siege weapons. The same man who painted Christ's final meal also dissected human corpses to understand muscle movement. Art and science, piety and empiricismal, tangled in one man's compulsive need to know. It's no wonder the Last Supper has been layered with codes and conspiracies ever since. When science and spirituality share a canvas, the line's blurred mystery takes root. From divine drama to sitcom punchlines, we shift now to a fictional actor with a two-word line who somehow became television's most persistent meme. The Friends character who was a struggling actor and his catchphrase. Joey Tribbiani. He wasn't the smartest friend, or the most responsible, or the most employed, but he was the one with a catchphrase that somehow stuck. How you doin'? Delivered with a wink and a smirk, it became the embodiment of sitcom sleaze charm. Simple, stupid, unforgettable. The coincidence is layered. Joey, a struggling actor in the show, often floundered in his auditions, constantly cast as extras, corpses, or unconvincing doctors. Yet in real life, Matt LeBlanc's portrayal became iconic. An actor playing, an actor who couldn't act, acted so well he became globally beloved. The line, originally a throwaway, turned into a defining punchline. School kids, adults, celebrities, they all borrowed it. It entered the lexicon, detached from its origin. What was once a goof became a cultural echo. Even more ironic, Joey's fictional failures made the real Matt LeBlanc a success. The character's incompetence was the actor's triumph. Failure, in this case, was the performance. And while Joey was trying to get famous one role at a time, another artist defied every rule of radio and rewrote pop's idea of how long a song should be rolling like a stone and refusing to stop. The musician who sang, like a rolling stone, and the length of the song. Bob Dylan's Like a Rolling Stone hit the airwaves in 1965 and immediately disrupted everything. The lyrics were sprawling, cryptic, accusatoria, poetic, uppercut in verse. And then there was the length. Over 6 minutes, radio DJs groaned. Stations hesitated. Pop songs weren't supposed to be that long. But the coincidence? It didn't matter. It became a hit anyway. It was too good to ignore. Dylan wasn't aiming for the chart. She was aiming for liberation. The song was a purge, a howl against hypocrisy, wrapped in folk rock defiance. The fact that it succeeded commercially was the unexpected twist. The industry bent to Dylan, not the other way around. The phrase, like a rolling stone, had existed before, of course. But Dylan's usage gave it new life, turning it into a metaphor for alienation, reinvention, and the cost of freedom. And the song's success opened the floodgates for longer, weirder, more ambitious rock music. Suddenly, pop didn't have to be pretty. It could be raw, unapologetic. And while Dylan reshaped music with a sneer and a harmonica, another soldier-turned-satirist would pen a tale about windmills, delusion, and the blurry line between nobility and madness. The author of Don Quixote and his military service, Miguel de Cervantes wasn't just the man who created Don Quixote, the windmill-tilting knight of self-delusion. He was a wounded veteran of actual war. Before he wrote the book that launched modern Western literature, Cervantes fought in the 1571 Battle of Lepanto, one of the largest naval engagements in history. He was shot multiple times and lost the use of his left hand, earning him the nickname, the Cripple of Lepanto. The coincidence? The man who created literature's most enduring symbol of noble futility had personally experienced the brutal, bloody reality of war. Cervantes didn't imagine madness from a distance. He watched it happen in real time. Don Quixote's misadventures may read as satire, but they're soaked in empathy. Because Cervantes was the man who saw both heroism and absurdity up close. That a wounded soldier would later create a character who dreams of chivalry while misunderstanding the world speaks volumes. Cervantes knew what honor cost. he also knew how often it ended in pain, not praise. And speaking of cost, our next figure flew across the Atlantic to the sound of roaring applause only to lose what he loved most to a crime that remains one of America's darkest chapters. The first man to fly solo across the Atlantic and his baby's kidnapping. In 1927, Charles Lindbergh became the first person to fly solo, non-stop, across the Atlantic. 33 hours alone in a cramped cockpit, battling fatigue, ice, and radio silence. When he landed in Paris, he wasn't just a pilote, was a global icon, a modern hero in goggles and leather gloves, the embodiment of courage, progress, and the human spirit. But 5 years later, Lindbergh's story took a nightmarish turn. His infant son was kidnapped from the family's New Jersey home. The nation held its breath. Ransom letters followed. A body was found. The crime was brutal, the trial sensational, the execution swift. The coincidence? One of America's greatest heroes, celebrated for crossing an ocean, was brought to his knees by a crime that happened in his own home. A man who conquered the skies couldn't protect his child on the ground. It's a story that still haunts. Lindbergh, once the golden boy of aviation, was transformed into a figure of public sympathy and controversy. The air became his triumph, the earth, his tragedy. And while Lindbergh's drama played out in headlines, another composer was crafting high society farce for the stage where marriage, class, and chaos collided behind a velvet curtain. The composer of The Marriage of Figaro and his patronage. Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart's The Marriage of Figaro debuted in 1786 and immediately ruffled powdered feathers. Based on a banned French play that mocked aristocracy and championed servant ingenuity, it was a risky choice for courtly entertainment. And yet, Mozart premiered it in Vienna, under the nose and with the blessing of Emperor Joseph II. The coincidence? The opera that mocked hierarchical power was performed inside the very halls it mocked. Mozart's patron, Joseph II, supported Enlightenment ideals but ruled as an absolute monarch. It's like a king paying for his own roast. Figaro was subversive. Servants outwitted nobles. Class boundaries blurred. It was comedy, with knives under the laughter. And it was sanctioned by the emperor himself. Mozart needed that support. Patronage was survival. But he also couldn't help pushing boundaries. The court funded the art. The art mocked the court. That tightrope between obedience and rebellionis, the fuel behind Figaro's genius. It's not just beautiful music. It's a trapdoor in powdered wigs. And from monarchs under fire to monarchs in film, our next coincidence features a queen, played by a woman who channeled her with such force. Critics weren't sure where the actress ended and the regent began. The actress who played Elizabeth I in film and the real queen. Cate Blanchett didn't just play Queen Elizabeth, she became her. In Elizabeth, 1998, and Elizabeth, The Golden Age, 2007, Blanchett portrayed the Virgin Queen with razor-sharp precision, fragile yet fierce, romantic yet ruthless, mortal yet myth. She captured the transformation from uncertain girl to ironclad icon so convincingly that historians and audiences alike found themselves caught in the blur between performance and history. The coincidence? Blanchett, an Australian actress with no royal ties, managed to channel one of Britain's most iconic monarchs in a way that redefined the cinematic standard. And she did it twice, earning Oscar nominations both times, becoming the rare actor to portray the same real-life figure across multiple decades in their life. It's almost uncanny. An actress with no crown, no lineage, no political weight, embodying a woman who reigned over one of the most volatile periods in English history with unmatched control. Blanchett didn't just perform Elizabeth, she resurrected her. Critics didn't just applaud, they bowed. And while the screen queen commanded with speeches and strategy, another figure from a galaxy far, far away inspired a real-world Religiano crown. No throne, just robes, mysticism, and a glow-in-the-dark philosophy. The Star Wars character who became a religious figure. Obi-Wan Kenobi, Yoda, Luke Skywalker. These weren't just characters in a sci-fi opera, they were space monks with laser swords and cryptic mantras. And somewhere between "May the Force be with you" and the Jedi Code, a new idea emerged. What if this wasn't just fiction? What if this was theology? Enter Jediism, a real-life belief system inspired by the Jedi Order from Star Wars. It's not officially sanctioned by any galactic senate, but it has followers, tenets, and even census recognition in multiple countries. The coincidence is so absurd it feels like satire, a fictional order of celibate peacekeepers with mind tricks and mystical powers inspired actual people to adopt its ethics as a belief system. What began as a pop culture joke morphed into an existential philosophy. People cite Jediism for its moral compass, its focus on mindfulness, and its belief in an all-connecting energy, the Force, thinly veiled spirituality with a sci-fi twist. The creator of Star Wars, George Lucas, never intended to start a religion. But then, neither did Gene Roddenberry. Neither did Tolkien. And yet, mythology has a way of sneaking in through the back door of entertainment. And while Jediism found peace in the stars, ancient Rome once found only flames beneath the watch, or perhaps the fiddle, of an emperor turned arsonist in the public imagination. The Great Fire of Rome and Emperor Nero. 64 AD, Rome burns. For 6 days, flames consume the eternal city, devouring wooden tenements, temples, and marketplaces. Amid the chaos, a rumor takes hold. Emperor Nero stood atop a tower playing the lyre, watching his empire melt under firelight. The image is chilling. The symbolism? Rich with imperial apathy. The coincidence is this. Nero may not have started the fire. In fact, he likely wasn't even in the city when it began. But the myth stuck. It was too perfect. A deranged emperor fiddling as civilization collapsed? It wrote itself. And what makes the tale twist deeper is that Nero later used the disaster to justify a massive rebuilding campaign and to persecute Christians, scapegoating them as arsonists. Whether guilty or not, he took advantage of the crisis like a true opportunist. The man who didn't start the fire still got to dance in its ashes. Whether he fiddled or not, and fiddles didn't exist then, for the record, the narrative endures. Because sometimes, what we want from history isn't truth, it's metaphor. Nero became the blueprint for leaders, ignoring catastrophe with a tune on their lips. And while Nero burned history down, another man shattered it, cubing it, distorting it, and living long enough to see his chaos canonized. The painter who invented Cubism and his lifespan. Pablo Picasso didn't just paint the dismantled reality and rebuilt it from fractured geometry. With Cubism, he tore apart perspective itself, turning faces into puzzles and guitars into origami. What's strange isn't just that he invented a style, it's how long he lived with it. Born in 1881, Picasso didn't die until 1973, outliving most of his critics, movements, and even revolutions. The coincidence? The man who broke visual art into shards lived to see modern art go full circle from rebellion to institution. He watched Cubism become gallery canon. He saw his once radical work sold for millions, collected by the very elites he used to thumb his nose at. He lived through 2 world wars, the fall of empires, the rise of television, and still had time to sketch doves for peace conferences. It's not just that he invented Cubism, it's that he got to watch it grow old with him. And while Picasso's cubed universe remained motionless on canvas, another fictional family once took their dysfunction international broadcasting American absurdity in the form of sushi, game shows, and a cultural exchange that escalated into chaos. The Simpsons episode where they go to Japan. In 30 Minutes Over Tokyo, the Simpson family goes on vacation and crashes directly into Japan's most surreal pop culture exports. From sumo wrestling to high-tech toilets, from ramen to bizarre game shows that involve electrocution and near-death humiliation, the episode is a fever dream of American confusion abroad. The coincidence? The Simpsons, known for lampooning American suburbia, ended up creating one of the most vivid and exaggerated portrayals of Japan in Western media right as Japanese pop culture was exploding globally. Pokemon, anime, technology, fashion. The same year this episode aired, Japan was everywhere. And The Simpsons didn't just parody it, they absorbed it, mutated it, and re-exported it as satire. It was a cultural feedback loop. America watching Japan watching America. Marge quotes haiku, Homer fights sumo wrestlers, and Bart accidentally triggers an international incident. Classic Springfield, now with sushi. The show's trademark chaos translated effortlessly. And that's the strange harmony. Different culture, same dysfunction. But while Homer fell into koi ponds and vending machines, another musician, centuries earlier, had written a set of concertos so vivid they practically painted seasons, each one composed by a red-haired priest who gave nature a violin. The musician who composed the Four Seasons and his nickname. Antonio Vivaldi, the man behind the Four Seasons, wasn't just a composer, was a priest, a red-haired one no less, which earned him the nickname Il Prete Rosso, the Red Priest. But don't picture a solemn cleric humming hymns in candlelight. Vivaldi was flamboyant, prolific, and so creatively restless, he churned out more than 500 concertos, many of which were written for orphaned girls at the Ospedale della Pietà in Venice. The coincidence? A priest sworn to a life of quiet devotion became the composer of some of the most passionate, playful, and sensuous music ever written. The Four Seasons doesn't just sound like spring or summer, it feels like it. Birds chirp, storms rumble, peasants dance, frost bites. He didn't just write music, he painted with sound. Vivaldi's dual life, man of God and man of theateris, part of the intrigue. His sacred profession contrasted beautifully with his tempestuous art. And while he faded into obscurity after death, his concertos came roaring back centuries later, played in every concert hall, commercial, and elevator. And as Vivaldi turned weather into melody, another author turned dystopia into prophecy mapping. A world of surveillance, control, and doublethink that felt impossible, until it wasn't. The author of 1984 and his warning. George Orwell's 1984 wasn't just a novel, it was a siren, a dystopia so bleak, so methodically controlled that it seemed more allegory than prophecy. Big Brother, thought crime, doublethink, the idea that language itself could be weaponized into a tool of domination. Orwell published it in 1949, when the ashes of totalitarian regimes still smoldered and Cold War paranoia was just heating up. The coincidence? The deeper we marched into the 21st century, the more his fiction began to look like a manual. Mass surveillance, algorithmic censorship, data harvesting, political double-speak-it, all started to resemble the world Orwell imagined in terrifying detail. The novel was meant as a warning, not a blueprint, yet it often feels like governments and tech companies read it and thought, not a bad idea. Even Orwell's invented language newspeak feels familiar in today's landscape of euphemisms and carefully managed narratives. What he created as speculative fiction has become disturbingly descriptive. And while Orwell stripped reality down to its bare bones, another actor known for stoic logic and pointed ears would spend his off-screen life capturing moments through a very different lens zone that saw poetry in shadows and humanity in stillness. The actor who played Mr. Spock and his photography. Leonard Nimoy was the face of logic. As Mr. Spock, he embodied cold reason, half-human conflict, and the occasional eyebrow raise that said more than most monologues. But beyond the Starfleet uniform and the Vulcan salute, Nimoy was quietly chronicling humanity through another art form: photography. The coincidence? The actor best known for portraying a character defined by detachment spent his real-life career exploring vulnerability, identity, and emotion through the camera lens. His photographic work, sometimes controversial, often intimate, focused on themes of transformation, gender, and the sacred. He captured what Spock could never express, the messiness of being fully human. "It's almost poetic," Spock observed the world. Nimoy framed it. He published several photo books, including The Full Body Project, which celebrated bodies deemed non-normative by societal standards. The man who played an alien explored alienation in real life and turned it into art. And while Nimoy gave voice to introspective silence, another queen historically misunderstood and tragically mythologized supposedly gave voice to cake. But history has a bitter way of twisting sweet words. The queen who said, "Let them eat cake," misattribution. Marie Antoinette never said it. The infamous line, "Let them eat cake," was attributed to her centuries later, a neat little quote that perfectly captured elite apathy and revolutionary rage. But there's no record of her uttering those words, no witnesses, no documentation. It likely came from Rousseau, written when she was still a child. The coincidence? The woman who became a symbol of decadence and disconnection was actually more complex and, arguably, more sympathetic than the quote suggests. She was a foreign queen in a hostile court, surrounded by backstabbing courtiers and political landmines. Yes, she wore diamonds. Yes, she had a private Hamlet for pretend peasantry. But her legacy was distorted by propaganda and simplified by history's hunger for villains. The quote stuck because it worked. It gave the revolution a face to blame, a punchline to justify the guillotine. And that's the unsettling truth. Sometimes, the things people never said are the things they're most remembered for. From sugar-coated slander to psychedelic soundscapes, our next band ditched their original name for something more iconic and, in doing so, rewrote the rules of rock while quietly sipping tea in a basement. The band, Pink Floyd, and their early name. Before they became the architects of sonic existentialism, Pink Floyd were just another London band with a rotating nameplate. They were called the T-Set, then the Screaming Abdabs, then the Megadeths. Charming, but forgettable. The moment of transformation came when Syd Barrett, their original frontman, mashed together the names of two American bluesmen, Pink Anderson and Floyd Counseland, birthed something new, Pink Floyd. The coincidence? The band, known for their futuristic sound and high-concept albums, took their name from two obscure blues musicians. The group that gave us The Dark Side of the Moon, Wish You Were Here, and the Wall Meditations on insanity, alienation, and authoritarianisms rooted in the musical traditions of the American South. It's a paradox they never tried to resolve. The psychedelic pioneers didn't hide their roots, they warped them, bent them through analog synthesizers, philosophical despair, and stadium-sized paranoia. But deep beneath the soundscapes, the ghosts of blues still hummed. And while Floyd looked to the stars and inner space, another painter looked to the dirt, the pitchfork. The plain face sand created an image so iconically American that it became both a celebration and a critique of everything it portrayed. The artist who painted American Gothic in the Great Depression. In 1930, Grant Wood submitted a painting to the Art Institute of Chicago, a stern-looking farmer with a pitchfork, and a woman who may or may not be his wife. Behind them, a white farmhouse with a Gothic window. The painting was called American Gothic, and it won a bronze medal, quietly beginning its transformation into one of the most recognizable images in American art. The coincidence lies in its timing. The painting debuted at the dawn of the Great Depression, a moment when rural America was suffering, starving, and scraping by. And yet, American Gothic shows none of that. It's severe, almost stoic, emotionless. Some saw it as a tribute to resilience. Others read it as a satire of small-town repression. Grant Wood never clarified. he left the interpretation as open as the farmhouse window. He painted the face of a country that was about to unravel and somehow captured both its pride and its quiet despair. And while Wood's stoic figures stood frozen in frame, another fictional apartment far more chaotic and definitely louder would change its numbers mid-series, sparking a minor mystery for obsessive fans of sitcom real estate. The Friends apartment number. Friends was a show of details: a couch, a coffee shop, a central perk window. But one detail kept shifting like a New York subway map under renovation: the apartment numbers. Monica and Rachel's place started as number 5. Later, it became 20. Joey and Chandler's went from 4 to 19. No plot explanation, no dialogue about moving, just a quiet change. The coincidence? The showrunners altered the numbers mid-series to better reflect the reality of New York apartment buildings. A 6th-floor walk-up wouldn't logically be numbered 5, but instead of fixing it with a script note or story arc, they just swapped the numbers and hoped no one would notice. They underestimated the fans. The switch became one of those trivia tidbits that obsessive viewers clung to like a Ross divorce. It's meaningless, but also symbolic. A show about permanent sexist friends frozen in time had this one tiny shifting inconsistency. A floor that didn't quite match, an address that moved while pretending not to. It's sitcom surrealism, subtle, harmless, and yet curiously compelling. Just like another man, lost in ice, trapped in darkness, dragging his crew toward survival while history watched and waited. The explorer who was stranded in the Antarctic and his survival. Ernest Shackleton set out in 1914 with a goal both poetic and mad: to cross the Antarctic continent. What he got instead was a masterclass in endurance, leadership, and unrelenting bad luck. His ship, the Endurance, lived up to its name. Ironically, it was crushed by pack ice before he ever set foot on the continent. Stranded with his crew, Shackleton began an odyssey of survival that defied logic and probability. The coincidence? The man who failed his expedition in every conventional sense became a hero precisely because of that failure. Shackleton didn't discover new lands or plant flags. He kept 28 men alive in one of the most hostile places on Earth, navigating lifeboats across storm-torn seas, then hiking over mountains without maps. Not a single life was lost. In an age obsessed with conquest, Shackleton made survival the headline. It's the rare tale where everything goes wrong, and that's the reason it went right. Shackleton's failure became his legend. He promised his men they'd survive, and somehow, they did. From frozen wastelands to fire and fury, we leap now to another composer who, centuries later, would summon something just as primal an ancient chant turned cinematic thunder. The composer of Carmina Burana and its use in film. Karl Orff's Carmina Burana begins with a punch to the chest. O Fortuna, the opening movement, is the sound of gods getting angry, or maybe planets crashing into one another. It's been used in countless films, trailers, and commercials, usually when something apocalyptic is about to happen. Thunder, blood, judgment. But the coincidence? Orff didn't write the words. They were pulled from a 13th century manuscript discovered in a Bavarian monastery. Latin verses about fate, lust, gambling, and the instability of fortune. Orff merely put them to music that would become the unofficial soundtrack to epic doom. And here's the irony. Orff saw Carmina Burana as the beginning of his true compositional career. It was a new start, a reinvention. And yet, it's now inseparable from endings, disasters, and dramatic final acts. A piece born from medieval drunken poetry became the most serious thing in cinema. The chant of monks turned into the roar of monsters. And from the storm of fate, we return to the quiet moors where another recluse scribbled a story of obsession, ghosts, and love, so cruel it felt like a curse carved into the earth. The author of Wuthering Heights and Her Isolated Life, Emily Bronte lived on the edge of nowhere, The Yorkshire moors were her landscape, her prison, her palette. She barely left her village. She published just one novel. She avoided society like it was a disease. And from this intense isolation came Wuthering Heights, a book so raw, violent, and emotionally volcanic that it shocked Victorian readers into pearl-clutching spasms. The coincidence? A woman who barely interacted with the world wrote one of the most psychologically complex, emotionally unhinged love stories in English literature. Heathcliff and Catherine weren't lovers. They were metaphysical train wrecks, bound by something darker than affection. The novel wasn't romantic. It was tragic, gothic, ferocious. Emily's life was the inverse of her story. She lived quietly, rarely spoke, preferred walking alone with her dog to socializing. And yet inside her burned this hurricane of words, characters, and doomed passion. Wuthering Heights was published under a male pseudonym. It was misunderstood, then revered, like Emily herself. And from brooding moors and doomed love, we beam up to a future where a fictional helmsman turned real-life advocate shifting from warp speed to human rights, with a grace few saw coming. The Star Trek character and the actor's real-life advocacy. George Takei played Hikaru Sulu, helmsman of the USS Enterprise Calm Presence, on the bridge of a futuristic starship, steering humanity toward the stars. But off-screen, Takei charted a very different course. He became one of the most vocal advocates for LGBTQ+ rights and historical remembrance, particularly the internment of Japanese Americans during World War I, something he experienced firsthand as a child. The coincidence? The man who portrayed a future where race, sexuality, and nationality were irrelevant was also shaped by a past in which those same traits were reasons for imprisonment. Sulu piloted a ship in a utopian future. Takei survived one of the darkest chapters in modern American history. His advocacy isn't just publicist, it's deeply personal. Takei uses his platform to illuminate injustice, to bridge past and present. He's turned sci-fi symbolism into real-world activism, blending nostalgia with necessity. It's a rare symmetry, a fictional character modeling a better future, played by a man who's fighting to create that future in reality. And while Takei speaks truth to power, another emperor once sliced his crumbling empire in half, marking the beginning of a slow, majestic disintegration that no senate could prevent. The emperor who divided the Roman Empire. In 285 AD, Emperor Diocletian looked at the sprawling chaos of the Roman Empire and did something few rulers dare. He broke it. Officially, he called it reform. He divided the empire into east and west, appointing co-emperors and sub-emperors in a system called the tetrarchy. It was meant to stabilize Rome, distribute power, and make governing more efficient. The coincidence? The move that was supposed to save the empire was also the first major structural crack in its eventual collapse. Diocletian didn't destroy Rome, but he institutionalized the split that would make it easier for barbarians, politics, and time to finish the job. It's the ancient version of a business merger that becomes a friendly divorce, then a bitter lawsuit, then bankruptcy. What began as clever governance became an accelerant for decline. And yet, Diocletian retired, voluntarily, grew cabbages in his villa, watched from afar as the thing he tried to preserve began to rot, like Nero, but with fewer flames. And from empires splitting at the seams, we zoom into a single, iconic, face enigmatic, serene, and eyebrow-less painted by a man who was too curious for comfort. The painter of the Mona Lisa and her eyebrows. You know the painting. The Mona Lisa smiling, or maybe not gazing from behind a Renaissance haze, forever paused in a moment of psychological ambiguity. But look closer, closer. You'll notice something missing. Eyebrows and eyelashes. Her face is smooth, untouched, as if time or taste had shaved them away. The coincidence. Leonardo da Vinci, obsessive anatomist and detail addict, the man who dissected corpses just to understand how muscles moved under skin, didn't give the Mona Lisa eyebrows. Or if he did, they were later scrubbed away by restoration, varnish, or fading pigments. Historians argue about it. Some say it was the style of the time. Others claim it's unfinished. Or too finished. Whatever the reason, the absence has become a presence. People notice what isn't there more than what is. The Mona Lisa's missing brows have become part of her mystery. Like her smile, they make her unreadable. In a painting full of subtle gestures and hidden codes, the blankness where emotion often lives creates a vacuum of intent. And while her eyes follow you across the room, another yellow-skinned family would find their entire world encased in glass when Springfield's environmental disaster finally made it to the big screen. The Simpsons movie and its environmental theme. For years, The Simpsons flirted with cinematic scale inside a 22-minute television box. But in 2007, they finally broke out into a full-length movie that, strangely, turned Homer Simpson into an eco-terrorist by accident. The plot? Homer pollutes a lake so badly that the government encases all of Springfield in a giant glass dome. The solution? Blow it up. The coincidence? A series infamous for its sarcasm, irreverence, and crude humor pivoted without warning into an environmental allegory. The same show that once joked about three-eyed fish became a kind of animated silent spring, complete with EPA villains, toxic waste, and a crowd-pleasing pig named Spider Pig, whose waste nearly ended civilization. And here's the real kicker. The movie came out just as global anxiety about climate change was spiking. Al Gore had just won a Nobel Prize for his climate work. An inconvenient truth was fresh in the public's mind. The Simpsons movie, intentional or no, trode that wave of eco-panic with slapstick and sarcasm. It was commentary disguised as chaos. But, underneath the gags, the glass dome became a metaphor for isolation, control, and consequence. And as Homer blew his way out of confinement, another Jasmine once blew a trumpet into history singing sweetness while secretly gasping for air. The musician who sang, "What a Wonderful World," and his battle with illness. Louis Armstrong's gravel-coated voice crooning "What a Wonderful World" has become the universal soundtrack for hope, innocence, and fragile beauty. The irony? He recorded it during a time of intense racial tension and personal health struggles. Armstrong had battled chronic health problems for much of his life, heart issues, respiratory complications, and bouts of illness that shadowed his later career. The coincidence lies in the contrast. A man in physical decline, singing about blooming trees, bright skies, and babies crying. Armstrong didn't just perform the song, he defied it, embodying its optimism while battling the exact opposite behind the scenes. The song didn't initially chart well in the US, but in Europe, it soared. It wasn't until years later, after being featured in movies like Good Morning, Vietnam, that it gained the mythic status it holds today. Armstrong's life was complicated. Raised in poverty, facing racism, breaking barriers, battling health, and yet, that voice, that warmth, that joy. He sang through pain, which is why the song still hits like a sunbeam through storm clouds. And while Armstrong sang of skies of blue and clouds of white, another ancient poet once penned a blinding act of defiance, trading hospitality for survival with one eye and a sharpened stake. The author of the Odyssey and the blinding of the Cyclops. Homer's The Odyssey is a road trip through myth and madness, starring a wily war veteran who just wants to go home. Along the way, Odysseus encounters monsters, witches, temptresses, storms, and a very hungry Cyclops named Polyphemus. The one-eyed giant traps Odysseus and his men in a cave and plans to eat them. Slowly. So what does Odysseus do? He gets Polyphemus drunk, tells him his name is Nobody, then drives a sharpened stake into the monster's only eye. When the Cyclops howls for help, screaming that nobody is hurting me, his brethren ignore him. The coincidence? Homer, the blind poet, gave us one of the most iconic scenes of literal blinding in literary history. A man with no sight writing a story where sight and the loss of sight is central to power, perception, and deception. Odysseus doesn't win with strength. He wins with lies, with language. It's a moment that flips identity on its head, where being nobody is exactly what saves him. And as the Cyclops stumbles, blinded by hubris and alcohol, another visionary would redraw the borders of a continent, doubling a nation overnight in a purchase so bold it felt like theft in broad daylight. The president who made the Louisiana Purchase and the size of the U.S. Thomas Jefferson was a man of contradictions. He distrusted centralized power, idolized the yeoman farmer, and preached a strict reading of the Constitution. Then, in 1803, he doubled the size of the United States with the stroke of a pen, buying the Louisiana Territory from Napoleon for $15 million. A deal so enormous and so constitutionally questionable that even Jefferson had to do some ideological gymnastics to justify it. The coincidence? The man who believed in small government made the biggest real estate acquisition in American history. Jefferson, the apostle of limited federal power, turned around and expanded that power massively without any constitutional clause permitting land purchases of this scale. It was a gamble, a philosophical betrayal, and a geopolitical masterstroke. Napoleon, desperate for cash and distracted by war in Europe, sold what he barely owned. Jefferson, wary of empire, bought it anyway. Why? Because it was too good not to. The purchase added 828,000 square miles to the U.S., giving rise to westward expansion, manifest destiny, and centuries of conflict, growth, and transformation. And while Jefferson redrew maps, another band was just getting started, destined to roll through history with wrinkled faces, sharp riffs, and a name that practically dared time to stop them. The band, the Rolling Stones, and their age. They were young once. Mick Jagger, Keith Richards, Charlie Watts, Brian Jones, British kids, chasing American blues, snarling through amplifiers in a London basement. But somewhere between I Can't Get No Satisfaction and Steel Wheels, the joke stopped being about youth and became about not dying. The coincidence? The band named after perpetual motion, the Rolling Stones, just kept going. Formed in 1962, they outlived most of their peers, their own reputations, even their critics. They became the music industry's version of geological time. Sedimented, immortal, slightly eroded but still kicking. How does a band that sang about reckless living outlive half the rock pantheon? How do icons of rebellion become Sir Knights and headliners at royal jubilees? There's a strange poetry in it. The Stones were never supposed to grow up, but they did. Sort of. They aged without aging, rebelled without retiring, and kept moving because rolling is the point. Still on tour, still defiant, still outpacing time. And as the Stones carved wrinkles into rock and roll, another painter turned atrocity into masterpiece's canvas, soaked not in oil, but in the smoke of bombs, the cries of the innocent, and a scream that stretched beyond silence. The artist who painted Guernica and his later political activism. In 1937, Pablo Picasso painted Guernica in response to the bombing of a Basque town by Nazi Germany and Italian warplanes during the Spanish Civil War. The painting is a black and white tapestry of anguish. Twisted bodies, screaming horses, a dismembered arm clutching a broken sword. It's not realism, it's raw, psychic warfare rendered on canvas. The coincidence? Picasso, who once lived as a playboy of modern art, became one of the loudest visual voices against fascism and violence. The man who gave us cubism, so abstract, so aesthetic, suddenly painted horror without filters. Guernica wasn't just a painting. It was a warning, a record, a weapon. It toured the world to raise awareness. It became a symbol of anti-war protest. And Picasso, who had once been politically aloof, aligned himself with resistance, even refusing to allow Guernica to return to Spain until Franco's dictatorship ended. A man who once fractured faces for artistic fun used those same lines to speak truth to power. And just as Picasso's fragmented nightmare spoke for the voiceless, another paleontologist with a love life like sedimentary layers brought his neurosis and his fossils into America's favorite sitcom. The Friends character who was a paleontologist and his romantic woes. Ross Geller is the kind of man who can name every Jurassic period predator but can't keep a relationship alive for more than 3 episodes. A paleontologist by profession, Ross spends more time digging up emotional trauma than fossils. His love life is a museum of failed attemptsome preserved in wedding videos. Others in the trauma of the infamous "we were on a break." The coincidence? His scientific field paleontology is all about studying the long dead, and somehow so are his relationships. Ex-wives, canceled marriages, regrettable leather pants. Ross is a walking contradiction between intellect and emotional chaos. He knows everything about extinct species, yet fails repeatedly at understanding the people he loves most. But that's part of his tragic charm. Ross represents the awkward collision between intellect and vulnerability, between knowing the right thing and doing the absolute worst thing at the worst possible moment. For someone who studies bones, he really can't pick up the ones life throws at him. And while Ross remains forever tangled in the fossils of his past, another royal figure and icon of opulence, tragedy, and imperial twilight was linked by blood to the very family that would survive him in name, if not in unity. The last Romanov Tsar and his connection to the British royal family. Nicholas II, the last Tsar of Russia, ruled an empire with a divine right and a weak grip. His reign ended in exile, captivity, and Bulletin, abasement, alongside his family, executed by revolutionaries who had no patience for monarchs. But long before the gunshots, he shared a peculiar connection: blood. The coincidence? Tsar Nicholas II was a first cousin of King George V of Great Britain. Both were grandsons of Queen Victoria. In photographs, they looked almost identical: military mustaches, stiff posture, aristocratic bearing. At a glance, you could mistake one for the other, as if monarchy itself had a family resemblance. When the Russian Revolution exploded, there were whispers, please, that George V would offer asylum to his cousin, but Britain, fearing backlash, declined. The Romanovs were left stranded. The cousinly bond, so close in blood, unraveled in politics. What's unsettling is how narrow the gap was between survival and erasure. One stayed on his throne, evolving with the times. The other vanished in gunfire and myth. And while the last Tsar met his fate underground, a global stage was being set, made not of marble or gold, but iron, glass, and Victorian ambition inside a palace designed to show the future.